The sentence on Lady Tamsin Lydgate's slate had been scraped away so violently that white dust still clung to the schoolroom table when Margaret Ward entered at 5:30. Westmere House was preparing for dinner. Below stairs, silver was being counted, candles were being trimmed, and footmen moved through the corridors with the hushed urgency that always came before aristocratic company. Upstairs, in the third-floor schoolroom, the youngest daughter of the Duke of Westmere sat very still, with both hands folded over her primer, as though a child of 8 could make herself invisible by behaving like a porcelain doll. Margaret saw the slate first. Then she saw Tamsin's face. "Who did that?" she asked softly. Tamsin's grey eyes flickered toward the door. "I don't know." It was not a lie, not quite. It was the careful answer of a child who had learned that truth could be punished if spoken before the wrong person. Margaret crossed the room without haste. Haste frightened children. Anger frightened them more. She picked up the slate and tilted it toward the window, where the late spring light lay thin and pale across the floorboards. Beneath the scraped marks, a few stubborn strokes remained. Aunt Fee said Papa must not see. Margaret felt the words settle into her chest like a stone. She did not speak them aloud. Behind her, Tamsin made the smallest sound, not quite a sob. Margaret set the slate down and drew the worn hornbook from the shelf beside the globe. Its handle had been rubbed smooth by years of use, and the transparent cover over the alphabet was clouded at the edges. Her father had taught parish children with it long before it became hers. Now she placed it between herself and Tamsin like a small, familiar bridge. "We shall begin again," she said. "Not with what frightened you, with something true." Lady Venetia said, "I must read from the new page tonight." "Tonight is a dinner for grown people," she said, patronesses like clever children. Margaret opened the hornbook to the alphabet and smiled, though the unease inside her did not loosen. Patronesses like obedient performances. Cleverness is something quieter. Tamsin looked at her as if that sentence itself were a candle. "May I be quiet, clever. You may be honestly clever." The child bent over the hornbook. Together they read the letters. Then, the simple lines Margaret had copied that morning from a botanical note. "The garden violet opens when the light is gentle. The rose closes when handled roughly." Tamsin read both without stumbling. Margaret praised her once, corrected one sound, and did not mention the scraped slate again. That was when Lady Venetia Sallow came in without knocking. She was dressed for dinner already, in a pale green silk gown that made her look fresh, expensive, and faintly poisonous. Her widow's cap was more decorative than mournful, and her smile never reached the eyes with which she inspected the table. The hornbook, Tamsin's bent head, and Margaret's plain dark gown. "How industrious," she said. "One might almost mistake this room for a charity school." Tamsin's fingers tightened around the edge of the primer. Margaret rose. "Lady Tamsin has read very well this afternoon." "Has she?" Venetia moved to the table and lifted the copied botanical page between 2 fingers. "How unusual. Mr. Bracknell's memorandum suggests quite the opposite." Margaret held herself still. "Then, Mr. Bracknell has been misinformed. Or you have been flattering yourself, Miss Ward." Venetia's voice remained light, but the room changed around it. Tamsin lowered her eyes. "You have encouraged the child to question instruction. You have allowed her to think a governess's approval is more important than obedience to her family. That is a dangerous confusion in a noble house. Reading is not disobedience. No, but teaching a child to hide behind clever phrases may become it." Venetia's gaze touched the slate. For one cold second Margaret understood that the scraped words had not been an accident. His Grace must be told. His Grace should be told the truth, Margaret said. Venetia smiled, naturally. By 6 o'clock, the schoolroom had become a tribunal with nursery wallpaper. The Duke of Westmere stood near the mantel, tall, severe, and still dressed in mourning. Black, though the first year had passed. Arthur Lydgate had the kind of face society called noble because it did not have to call it kind. His features were composed, his eyes dark, his mouth controlled as though every word must first pass a court of private discipline. Margaret had served in his house for 14 months and had rarely been looked at by him for longer than a necessary instruction. Tonight, he looked at her as if he were deciding whether she had become a danger in his own walls. Mr. Eustace Bracknell stood beside Lady Venetia with a folded paper in hand. He was a narrow man with careful whiskers, a polished watch chain, and the damp air of someone who enjoyed being useful to power. The housekeeper, Mrs. Vale, had been summoned. 2 maids lingered near the passage, pretending not to listen. Tamsin sat in the corner chair, white-faced and silent. Margaret remained beside the schoolroom table, one hand resting near the hornbook, the other at her side. "Your Grace," Bracknell said, "I regret the necessity of speaking plainly. The child's progress has declined. There are signs of nervous attachment, irregular instruction, and undue influence." Arthur's eyes moved to Tamsin. Tamsin. She flinched at her own name. Something passed over his face then, something almost like pain. But Venetia stepped smoothly into the space before it could become a question. "The poor darling has been overwrought for weeks. Miss Ward mistakes dependence for education." Margaret looked directly at the Duke. Lady Tamsin read 3 botanical sentences today without error. Her copybook will show the same progress over the past month. "Copybooks can be selected," Bracknell said. "Children can be coached, and memoranda can be written by men who have not sat 1 hour in this room," Margaret replied. A maid gasped. Venetia's brows lifted with delicate satisfaction, as if Margaret had finally stepped where she had been expected to step. Arthur's expression hardened. "Miss Ward." His voice was quiet enough to be more dangerous than anger. "You will remember your position." Margaret felt the words strike, but she did not lower her head. "I remember it exactly, Your Grace. That is why I am answering a charge made against my work." "Your work?" Venetia repeated. Listen to her, as though a duke's daughter were a parish child with muddy shoes. Tamsin whispered, "I like the parish stories." No one seemed to hear except Margaret. Arthur did not take his eyes from the paper in Bracknell's hand. "This memorandum recommends removal from your instruction." Margaret's heartbeat became very distinct. On what evidence? On sufficient concern. Concern is not evidence. Arthur looked up then, fully. For the first time that evening, his gaze met hers, and Margaret saw not cruelty, but exhaustion sharpened into pride. It did not comfort her. Pride could wound as cleanly as malice. You speak very boldly for a woman whose judgment is under question. A woman's livelihood often depends on whether she speaks before the door closes. Venetia gave a soft sigh. "Your Grace, this is precisely what I feared." Miss Ward has forgotten that affection from a child does not make her indispensable. The word hung there, indispensable. Something in Arthur's face closed. Perhaps grief did it, perhaps fear. Perhaps the old habit of rank hearing challenge as insolence. He looked from the slate to the memorandum, from the trembling child to the governess who refused to tremble enough. "No one in this house is indispensable," he said. The rooms seemed to draw in breath. Margaret's palm brushed the hornbook's worn handle. She thought of her father's hand covering hers as she learned the alphabet. She thought of Tamsin reading slowly, bravely, while adults tried to turn learning into obedience. She thought of every reduced gentlewoman who survived on references written by people who had never noticed the difference between service and devotion. Arthur's voice cut through the silence. "I can hire 50 like you." Tamsin made a broken sound. Mrs. Vale looked down. Lady Venetia's smile became almost invisible, which made it worse. Margaret felt the sentence pass through her, taking with it 14 months of careful patience, late candles, mended confidence, corrected letters, soothed nightmares, and quiet loyalty no one had priced because no one had seen it. Her throat hurt, her back remained straight. She picked up the schoolroom keys from her chatelaine and placed them on the table. The small sound of metal against wood was clearer than a bell. Then she laid the hornbook beside them. For one instant, her fingers rested on the old handle. She had almost nothing else of her father. Still, she left it there. If she took it, they would say she stole schoolroom property. If she clutched it, Venetia would call it sentimentality. If she wept over it, the Duke might mistake grief for guilt. Margaret lifted her eyes to Arthur Lydgate. He looked faintly startled, as if he had expected pleading, explanation, perhaps fear. She gave him none. "Do it, Your Grace." The words were calm. That was the part that changed the room. She turned to Tamsin and softened only her eyes. "You remember what we practiced?" Tamsin's lips trembled. The violet opens when the light is gentle. Yes, Margaret curtsied to the Duke with exact correctness, not low enough to beg, not shallow enough to insult. Then she walked to the door. Behind her, Bracknell shifted papers. Venetia murmured something about regrettable necessity. Arthur said nothing. Silence followed Margaret into the corridor, down the narrow stair, past the landing, where the nursery maid pressed a hand to her mouth, and toward the servants' passage, where the house smelled of beeswax, candle smoke, and dinner not yet served. No one stopped her. That almost broke her. At the final turn, before the corridor opened toward the back stairs, she heard small feet strike the floorboards above. Tamsin's voice rang out, thin and desperate. "Papa, she taught me the sentence. Lady Venetia told me never to read." Margaret stopped with one hand on the banister. She did not turn back. Not yet. In the schoolroom behind her, for the first time all evening, the Duke of Westmere spoke as though the floor had shifted beneath him. What sentence? And in that pause, while Margaret stood alone, with her gloves damp against her palms and her future, narrowing to a dark London street, the house that had called her replaceable finally began to understand that something necessary had just walked out. Lady Tamsin Lydgate did not answer her father at once. She stood in the schoolroom doorway, with both hands clenched in the skirt of her white muslin frock, staring not at the Duke of Westmere, not at Lady Venetia, not at Mr. Bracknell's folded memorandum, but at the place on the table, where Margaret Ward's hornbook lay beside the surrendered keys. "What sentence?" Arthur asked again, and this time his voice did not carry the cool command that had sent men silent at committees and tenants stiff-backed in estate offices. It was lower, less certain. Tamsin looked toward Lady Venetia. The lady's smile had not altered, yet one gloved hand had tightened around the back of a chair. "The child is overwrought," Venetia said. "It would be unkind to press her." Arthur turned his head. "I asked my daughter." The room went still. Tamsin swallowed so hard the movement showed in her thin throat. Aunt Fee said Papa must not see. Mrs. Vale, the housekeeper, made the faintest sound. Mr. Bracknell lowered his memorandum by half an inch. Lady Venetia gave a little laugh, polished and wounded, a childish confusion. There are always phrases in lessons, Your Grace. Children borrow and distort what they hear. Where did you see that sentence? Arthur asked. Tamsin's eyes filled. On my slate. His gaze moved to the slate on the schoolroom table. Its surface looked almost clean from a distance. Only when he crossed the room and lifted it toward the fading window light did he see what Margaret had seen. A violence of scraping, pale dust caught in the wood frame, a few stubborn strokes remaining beneath the damage. Aunt Fee said Papa must not see. Arthur felt the first true uncertainty of the evening open beneath his ribs. It was not yet proof. He knew that. He had been trained by rank, grief, and solicitors to distrust impressions. But the words were there, and the woman he had dismissed had not spoken them for herself. She had left them behind. Mrs. Vale, he said, place this slate in my study. Yes, Your Grace. No one is to clean it. Lady Venetia's eyes sharpened. Surely there is no need to preserve schoolroom nonsense as though it were evidence. Arthur looked at her. Then it will do no harm preserved. Tamsin began to cry then, silently at first, as if even tears had been trained to ask permission. Arthur took one step toward her. She stepped back. The movement was small. It struck him harder than accusation. By the time the dinner bell sounded below, Margaret Ward had gone from Westmere House, and the schoolroom, though full of people, felt emptied of its centre. The next morning, London rain had washed the windows to a dull silver, and Westmere House woke with the uneasy hush of a household that had witnessed something improper, but not yet been told what version of it would be allowed to survive. Arthur had not slept. At 7, he stood alone in the schoolroom, where the fire had been lit too late, and the air still held the chalky smell of scraped slate. Everything was in order. That was the first accusation. No drawer had been forced. No book had been taken. No ribbon, coin, trinket, or paper lay disturbed. The small ink bottles were wiped clean. The primers were stacked by subject. Tamsin's copybooks were tied with blue tape and labelled by month in Margaret's neat hand. A woman who meant to flee scandal, Arthur thought, did not leave behind order like testimony. On his desk below, the slate had been placed exactly as ordered. On the schoolroom table, the hornbook remained where Margaret had laid it down, and, beside it, the ring of schoolroom keys looked strangely brutal, as if the metal itself remembered the sound it had made when she surrendered it. Arthur picked up the hornbook. It was not handsome. It was old, its handle darkened by years of use, the alphabet protected by a cloudy cover, worn smooth at the edges. This was no costly toy from a Mayfair shop. It had the plain dignity of something used because it mattered. He turned it over and found, lightly scratched near the handle, the initials F.W., not Margaret's. Her father's, perhaps. A clergyman's object. A poor man's inheritance. She had left even that. The door opened softly, Mrs. Vale entered with a curtsy and a face arranged into obedience. Lady Tamsin will not come down, Your Grace. Is she ill? No, Your Grace. Not in the ordinary way. Say what you mean. The housekeeper glanced toward the nursery passage. She will not read for Mr. Palmer. He came at Lady Venetia's request before breakfast. Her ladyship said a firm beginning would be best. Arthur set the hornbook down with more care than he had intended. Mr. Palmer is not to instruct my daughter. Very good, Your Grace. Mrs. Vale hesitated. He saw it. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he forced himself not to dismiss hesitation as inefficiency. You have something else to say. Only that Miss Ward often remained after lessons, Your Grace, when Lady Tamsin had been made to recite before visitors. She would forget passages she knew perfectly well. Miss Ward would stay until the child could read them again without fear. Arthur looked at the copybooks. Why was I not told? Mrs. Vale lowered her eyes. Miss Ward said Lady Tamsin's dignity mattered more than making a complaint. The answer was quiet. It condemned him more effectively than reproach. Arthur untied the blue tape from the nearest copybook. Page after page showed Tamsin's hand, uncertain at first, then steadier, small sentences about flowers, birds, scripture, household objects, seasons. Margaret's corrections were spare and gentle. Good. Try the sound again. Better. Read once more, slowly. On one page, several lines had been scratched over by a heavier hand. Not a child's correction. Arthur bent closer. Beneath the ink, he could make out fragments. Papa must not see. Good girls fail prettily. If I read well, she goes. His fingers tightened on the page. Who has had access to these books? Miss Ward, Lady Tamsin, myself on occasion, the nursery maid Ellen, and Lady Venetia when she wished to inspect progress. Mr. Bracknell, Mrs. Vale's mouth compressed. He has been in the schoolroom twice this month with her ladyship. Miss Ward did not approve. Arthur almost heard Margaret's voice again. Concern is not evidence. He had heard the sentence as insolence. Now it returned as instruction. A tap came at the door before Lady Venetia entered, though not long enough to be refused. Morning suited her less than candlelight. Without silk and dinner jewels to soften her edges, her composure looked harder. Arthur, dearest, you must not let one unfortunate scene unsettle the necessary course. Tamsin's nerves are plainly disordered. Mr. Palmer agrees that an establishment outside London may be the kindest remedy. An establishment, a quiet private one, highly recommended, removed from unhealthy attachment. To Miss Ward, Venetia sighed with exquisite patience. To dependence. There is a difference. Arthur closed the copybook. I have not signed any transfer. Not yet, nor shall I do so today. For one instant her face emptied. Then sympathy returned to it, swift as a curtain falling. Of course, grief makes decisions difficult. He looked at her then, truly looked. My grief is not under discussion. A flush touched her throat. I only meant to protect the child. From the nursery passage came the sound of a small chair scraping, then a muffled sob. Arthur moved past Venetia without asking leave. In the nursery, Tamsin sat rigid beside the window, while Mr. Palmer, a dry gentleman with a pointed chin, held a primer as though it were a disciplinary instrument. Ellen, the nursery maid, hovered near the washstand, miserable. Arthur stopped in the doorway. Mr. Palmer, your services are not required. The tutor blinked. Your Grace, Lady Venetia indicated. Lady Venetia is not Tamsin's father. Mr. Palmer bowed himself out in offended silence. Tamsin did not run to Arthur. That, too, was a sentence he had to learn to read. He crouched at a careful distance, awkward in his own nursery, suddenly aware that dukes were not taught how to ask forgiveness from frightened children. Tamsin, he said, you will not be sent away today. Her eyes searched his face. Not today. Not at all, unless I know the truth and unless it is right for you. Miss Ward tells the truth. The words were immediate, absolute. Arthur bowed his head once, accepting the blow. I am beginning to understand that. She left her hornbook. Yes, it was her papa's. His throat tightened. I know. She won't come back if you make her feel wicked. There it was, the judgment of the only innocent person in the house. Arthur rose slowly. Ellen, send to the stables. My carriage is to be brought around. Venetia, who had followed to the nursery threshold, stiffened. Arthur, Surely you are not going to bring that woman back under these conditions. He turned. I am going to make certain Miss Ward is safe. She walked out of a ducal house after speaking to you with open disrespect. No. His voice was quiet enough that Ellen looked away. She walked out after I gave her cause. Venetia's lips parted. He did not wait for her reply. 10 minutes later, the Westmere carriage rolled from the mews into the wet London morning, its lamps unlit beneath the grey sky. Arthur sat inside, with Margaret's hornbook on the seat opposite him, wrapped now in a clean linen cloth Mrs. Vale had brought without being asked. He had sent no command for Margaret to return. He had written no note demanding explanation. The difference mattered, though he did not yet know whether she would believe it. At her lodging house near Bloomsbury, a narrow brick building with polished steps and lace curtains yellowed by coal smoke, the landlady received his card with an expression that changed from alarm to calculation to disapproval. Miss Ward left just after 9, Your Grace. Left for where? The governess registry in Southampton Row. She said she would not wait for hunger to make decisions for her. Arthur closed his hand around the edge of his glove. Of course she had. Margaret Ward had been insulted, deprived of reference, separated from the child who trusted her, and turned out beneath a cloud. By morning, she had not collapsed. She had gone to seek work. Was she alone? Yes, Your Grace. And dry-eyed, if that is of interest to anyone. The landlady's boldness would have amused him on another day. Today it shamed him. He bowed slightly. It is. When he returned to the carriage, the hornbook still lay opposite him like a silent witness. Westmere House had not merely lost a governess. Tamsin had lost the one adult who made truth feel safe. And Arthur, who had believed he could replace a woman before he had bothered to know her, was beginning to suspect that the empty schoolroom had already judged him more accurately than any court in England. The governess registry in Southampton Row smelled of damp wool, sealing wax, and disappointment carefully disguised as respectability. Margaret Fenella Ward had been sitting on the straight-backed chair nearest the window for 23 minutes, long enough to learn that women without references were not interviewed so much as inspected. Across the room, a clerk in a brown coat turned the pages of her application as though misfortune might stain his fingers. Behind him, a row of ledgers stood locked in a glass-fronted cabinet, each spine labelled with a different category of female usefulness: nursery, governesses, finishing governesses, companions, readers, temporary situations. Margaret kept her gloves folded in her lap and her spine upright. She had slept little. Her lodging-house mirror had shown her a pale woman in a plain grey gown, with shadows beneath her eyes and one loosened strand of dark hair at her temple. She had pinned the strand back. She had washed her gloves at the basin. She had come here before hunger or fear could teach her to accept any place where her dignity would not be safe. The clerk looked up at last. Miss Ward, you were lately employed at Westmere House. Yes, in the service of His Grace the Duke of Westmere, as governess to Lady Tamsin Lydgate. For 14 months? Yes, he tapped the paper. And yet you bring no written character from that house. The word character sat between them with more force than accusation. A woman in Margaret's position might own nothing but her education, her reputation, and the manner in which former employers chose to describe both. I left only yesterday evening, she said. There has not yet been time for written correspondence. The clerk's mouth made a shape that was not quite a smile. One hears that there are circumstances in certain great households that make speed unnecessary. Margaret looked at him fully. One hears many things when one is willing to listen at the wrong doors. His brows rose. At another desk, an older matron with a cap of severe lace paused over her account book. The clerk lowered his voice. "It is my duty to protect families who apply to this registry. A noble child's mind is a delicate trust. If there has been any suggestion of excessive influence, unorthodox instruction, or emotional agitation, it must be noted before we can place you elsewhere." Margaret felt the heat rise under her collar, but she answered evenly. "Lady Tamsin's mind is not delicate glass. It is lively, observant, and easily frightened by public correction. She reads well when not made to perform for adults who prefer obedience to understanding. That is a bold distinction. It is an accurate one. Accuracy, Miss Ward, is best supported by a reference." The door opened behind her, letting in a breath of wet street air and the sound of carriage wheels passing over muddy stones. The registry grew silent with the peculiar instinct by which London rooms recognized rank before rank had spoken. Margaret did not turn at once. She knew before she looked. The clerk stood so quickly his chair scraped the floor. "Your Grace." Arthur Lydgate, Duke of Westmere, entered with his hat in one hand and Margaret's worn hornbook, wrapped in clean linen, beneath his arm. He had the grave, controlled appearance of a man who had crossed half of London without allowing himself haste, though the rain had darkened the shoulders of his coat. His eyes found Margaret first, not the clerk, not the ledgers, Margaret. Something in that directness unsettled her more than his anger had done, because anger at least had kept its distance. This look contained knowledge he had not possessed yesterday. Not enough, but some. "Miss Ward," he said. She rose because propriety demanded it, not because her knees felt steady. "Your Grace." The clerk bowed again, deeper. "We were just discussing the matter of references. I heard enough to gather that Miss Ward's character was being questioned." His voice remained quiet, but the room listened to it as if it were a gavel. "No charge has been proven against her." The clerk's color changed. "Naturally, Your Grace, I meant only that in cases of uncertainty. Then be certain of this. No slander is to be entered under my name." Margaret's fingers tightened around her gloves. It was protection. It was also late. The old matron behind the second desk watched them both with sharp interest. Arthur stepped closer, stopping at a proper distance, the hornbook still held carefully. "May I speak with you?" Margaret glanced toward the matron. "This is a public room. Then I shall speak carefully." A faint pause. "I owe you that much at least." The sentence touched the edge of apology without becoming one. Margaret did not reward it with softness. "You owe Lady Tamsin examination of her lesson books. I have begun it. Then you have seen the slate." "Yes." The word carried something rough beneath it. "And the copybooks?" "Some. Not enough, then." The clerk made a small offended movement at being ignored in his own office. Margaret turned back to Arthur. "If you came to ask me to return quietly, I cannot. I came first to make certain you were safe. Safety without a name is a narrow mercy for a governess." His jaw tightened. He accepted the blow. That surprised her. Yesterday he had received truth as insolence. Today he seemed to hold it as something deserved. "You are right." The room had gone so still that even the scratching pen at the far desk had ceased. Margaret disliked the sudden attention. She disliked more the small foolish ache that had opened when he admitted she was right. "Your Grace, Lady Tamsin did not decline under my instruction. She was made afraid to show what she knew." Arthur's gaze sharpened. "By whom?" "Ask why Lady Venetia wanted her to fail before witnesses." His eyes did not leave her face. "You believe Lady Venetia has interfered with the lessons. I know Lady Tamsin could read the passages. Lady Venetia claimed she failed. I know there are corrections in the copybooks that are not mine. I know, Mr. Bracknell's memorandum uses language no true teacher would use after observing a child for less than an hour. What language? Nervous attachment, irregular influence, ungovernable dependence, words arranged to make care sound like corruption." Arthur looked down at the linen-wrapped hornbook. "Tamsin said the hornbook belonged to your father." For one dangerous moment, Margaret saw the little parish room in which her father had sat with a line of children waiting to read. She saw his ink-stained thumb. She heard him say that a child must never be shamed for stumbling over a word, because shame could make the page itself seem cruel. She folded the memory away before it showed on her face. "It does. You left it. I left Westmere House under accusation. I was not going to carry away an object from the schoolroom and invite another. It was yours. Yesterday, Your Grace, very little in that room appeared to be mine. Not my work, not my judgment, not even my good name." He flinched, barely, but she saw it. A maid crossed the passage outside and paused to peer through the glass, then hurried on. The clerk cleared his throat. "Miss Ward, if His Grace is prepared to supply a temporary note of character, the registry may be able to hold your application open." Margaret turned. "No." Arthur's eyes lifted. The clerk blinked. "No, I will not have my reputation held open like a parcel awaiting payment. If His Grace writes, he must write the truth when he knows it, not a convenience to tide me over until his house decides whether I am guilty or useful." Arthur said nothing. His silence no longer felt like dismissal. It felt like a man being required, perhaps for the first time in years, to listen without ruling. "Miss Ward," he said at last, "what would you have me do?" That question changed the air between them. It was not enough to repair what he had broken. But it was different from command. Margaret drew one breath. "Examine the lesson books by date. Ask Mrs. Vale who entered the schoolroom. Ask Ellen what happened after public recitations. Ask Lady Tamsin what she read when she was not afraid. And do not ask the child in front of Lady Venetia. And you? I will seek employment. Without waiting. I waited 14 months for my work to be seen. That was quite long enough." On the table beside her chair sat the small pencil case she had brought from her lodging, plain black japanned wood with a loose brass clasp. As she reached for her gloves, the case slipped from the edge and fell open. 2 pencils rolled across the floor. Arthur bent at the same instant she did. Their hands reached for the same pencil, and for one suspended breath, their fingers hovered close enough that she felt the warmth of him through the cool air. Neither touched, neither withdrew at once. Margaret saw his hand clearly, strong and controlled, stopped before contact, as if he had remembered that he had no right to take even so small a liberty. Her pulse answered in a way she had not permitted. It angered her. It steadied her. She picked up the pencil first. "Thank you, Your Grace. I can manage the rest." He rose when she did. "I do not doubt it." That, too, was new. Margaret closed the pencil case and put on her gloves. The clerk hurried to open the door for the Duke, but Arthur did not move toward it. He held the wrapped hornbook out to her. "It should be returned to you." Margaret looked at the linen bundle, then at his face. She wanted to take it. The desire was so sharp it nearly shamed her. "Not here." "Why?" "Because if I receive it from your hands in a registry office, half the room will decide by supper that I left Westmere House with a gift from the Duke." Arthur's mouth tightened, not with anger this time, but with recognition. Then I will keep it safe until you permit me to return it properly. Keep it visible, she said. Objects hidden in great houses have a habit of changing meaning. I will, she curtsied, precise and restrained. Good morning, Your Grace, Miss Ward. His voice followed her as she turned toward the matron's desk to finish the interview she had not abandoned. That mattered. She did not leave because he had arrived. She did not stay because he asked. Arthur watched her reclaim her seat before a woman who could decide her bread, her roof, and her future. And for the first time, he understood that courage did not always raise its voice. Sometimes it sat down again, folded its gloves, and insisted on being judged by the truth. By the following afternoon, Arthur Lydgate had learned that a schoolroom could accuse more quietly than any witness. He stood alone beneath the sloped ceiling of the Westmere House schoolroom, while London's pale spring light pressed against the tall windows and revealed every disciplined trace of Margaret Ward's absence. The room was not sentimental. It did not plead for her. It simply refused to function without the order she had given it. The primers sat in their proper stacks. The ink bottles had been wiped at the neck. The globe had been turned to face Europe, where Tamsin had pasted a small paper flag upon England and written, in a careful child's hand, "Home is where one may ask questions." Arthur read that sentence twice before he touched it. He had spent years believing sorrow gave him permission to simplify the world. Servants served, advisers advised, relations protected family interests. A governess taught until she ceased to be useful. Yet the table before him had become a map of his error. On one side lay Tamsin's copybooks, steady and dated. On the other lay the scraped slate, which Mrs. Vale had placed in his study, and then brought up again at his request, wrapped in paper so no careless sleeve would disturb the remaining marks. In the cabinet near the window, he found a shallow drawer labeled Nature Words. Inside were pressed leaves, folded slips, and botanical labels tied with faded thread. Tamsin had written them herself: violet, primrose, fern ash leaf, rose hip. Some were uneven, some were smudged. All were legible. More importantly, many bore dates from weeks before Mr. Bracknell's memorandum claimed the child had lost discipline, sense, and capacity under Margaret's instruction. Arthur lifted one label and saw Margaret's small correction beneath it. Good. Try the curve of the R again. No flattery, no indulgence. Teaching. He closed his eyes briefly, not from tenderness, but from the ugly recognition that he had spoken as if skill were common, because he had never troubled to measure it. In the drawer below, behind a stack of ruled paper, he found a folded sheet in a woman's hand. He knew so well that grief struck before sense. Eleanor, the late Duchess of Westmere, had written with a slant that looked delicate until one tried to ignore it. Arthur opened the sheet slowly. It was not a love note, nor a memory, nor one of the frail messages she had left for him during her illness. It was an instruction regarding Tamsin. Lady Tamsin must never be displayed as a drawing-room accomplishment. She is quick, but easily shamed. Whoever teaches her must do so gently, without forcing her to recite before those who value performance over understanding. Miss Ward has the rare gift of seeing the child before the title. Do not let anyone make a spectacle of our daughter. Arthur sat down in Margaret's chair. It was too small for him, too plain, and yet he felt less like master of Westmere House in that chair than he had ever felt beneath his own crest. He had not known this paper existed. Venetia had been in and out of the schoolroom after Eleanor's death. Bracknell had handled family memoranda with the dry solemnity of a man who believed paper became truth if folded well enough, and Margaret, who had been accused of influence, had been following the last clear wish of the child's mother. A knock came. Mrs. Vale entered, carrying the linen-wrapped hornbook. "The carriage is ready, Your Grace." He looked at the hornbook, then at Eleanor's instruction. "Lady Venetia is not to enter this room without you present." The housekeeper's face changed only in the eyes. "Yes, Your Grace." "Nor Mr. Bracknell?" "Yes, Your Grace, and Mrs. Vale." She paused. "Your Grace, if Miss Ward's books or labels are moved, I am to know who moved them." Mrs. Vale curtsied. "I shall see to it myself." Half an hour later, Arthur stood in the narrow front parlour of Margaret's lodging-house near Bloomsbury, where respectability had been polished into every worn surface. The landlady had allowed him entry only after placing her maid in the hallway and leaving the parlour door open by a conscientious inch. Arthur approved of her for it. Margaret entered in the same grey gown she had worn at the registry, though the cuffs had been brushed, and her hair pinned with such care that it suggested not vanity but resistance. She stopped when she saw the hornbook in his hands. The stillness in her face was more difficult to bear than anger. "Mrs. Bell said, 'Your Grace asked to return something properly.' I did." He placed the linen parcel on the small table between them and did not unwrap it without permission. "You were right not to take it from me at the registry. I was thinking of survival, not etiquette. Often they are the same thing for a woman in your position." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in offense, but in surprise that he had understood even that much. Perhaps he drew a breath. "May I?" She nodded. He unfolded the linen and revealed the worn hornbook. For a moment, all her composure moved toward it. She did not reach. That restraint told him how much it cost her. "I found your initials were not on it," he said. "F.W. Frederick Ward, my father. Tamsin told me it was his." Margaret looked down. "He was a clergyman in a poor parish outside Oxford. He taught children who came to him with cold hands, torn cuffs, and more fear of being laughed at than of being wrong. He said the first duty of a teacher was to make the page less cruel." Arthur felt the sentence enter him with the force of something he could neither buy nor command. "That is what you did for my daughter." "I tried." "No." His voice grew lower. "You succeeded. I found her labels, her copybooks, and a paper written by Eleanor." Margaret's gaze lifted sharply. "The late Duchess. She wrote that Tamsin must be taught gently. She named you as someone who saw the child before the title." Margaret's face changed then. Not triumph, pain. "I never knew she wrote that. I believe you." The words came too late, but they came cleanly. Margaret absorbed them without softening. Belief after injury is not the same as trust before it. "No, it's not." He looked at the hornbook. "I came to return this, and to say that what I said in the schoolroom was wrong." The parlour seemed to hold its breath around them. From the hallway came the faint clink of the maid pretending to adjust a tray. Margaret kept her hands folded. "Which part?" Arthur met her eyes. He deserved that question. "All of it, but especially the part in which I mistook command for judgment. I saw fear in my daughter, a memorandum in Mr. Bracknell's hand, and your refusal to lower your eyes. I chose the explanation that cost my pride least." Margaret's lips parted slightly. She looked away first, and he knew enough now not to mistake that for weakness. An apology spoken in a lodging-house parlour does not repair a public stain. "I know. Do you?" "I am beginning to." Her gaze returned to his face. "Beginning is not enough." "No." He unfolded Eleanor's copied instruction and placed it beside the hornbook, not in her hand, not as bait, simply where she might read it. Lady Venetia has announced a public schoolroom examination before patronesses. She intends to prove Tamsin's supposed decline in front of witnesses. Margaret read the page. Her expression sharpened at once. The governess, overtaking the wounded woman. That would terrify her. Yes. Then stop it. If I stop it privately, Venetia will say I am concealing the damage. Margaret's fingers moved toward the hornbook. Arthur's hand was still near it. Their fingers brushed. Barely. It was nothing by the measure of society. A touch no wider than a breath. Yet it stopped them both. Arthur did not close his hand. Margaret did not snatch hers away. For that single suspended moment, the old hornbook lay between them, and the warmth of her skin through her glove seemed to accuse him of every liberty he had not earned. Then she lifted the hornbook and held it to her chest with careful dignity. "Thank you for returning it." His hand remained empty on the table. "Miss Ward." "Yes, Your Grace. Will you come to the examination?" "As what?" The question was quiet. It carried all that he had broken. Not governess, not servant, not accused woman, summoned for inspection. Arthur answered slowly because the answer mattered, as the person who knows my daughter's mind better than anyone in that room. Margaret looked at Eleanor's instruction, then at the hornbook. "I will come as an observer, not as your employee." "Agreed. I will not coach Lady Tamsin to perform. I would not ask it. And if she is frightened, I will not let them make a lesson of her fear." For the first time since she had walked out of Westmere House, something like fire entered her voice. Arthur felt it not as defiance now, but as protection. "Nor will I." She studied him as if deciding whether the promise had bones enough to stand. "We shall see, Your Grace." As he left the lodging-house, the rain had stopped, but the street remained wet and dark beneath the wheels of passing carriages. In his pocket lay the copied instruction from his dead wife. In Margaret's hands was the hornbook he had returned too late. And at Westmere House, Lady Venetia Sallow was preparing an examination meant to prove a child's failure, unaware that the first lesson Arthur Lydgate had truly learned in years was how poorly he had read the woman she meant to destroy. The invitation that brought Margaret Ward back to Westmere House arrived without a seal of command. That, more than the words themselves, made her read it twice. The paper was thick, the hand unmistakably the Duke's, and the message shorter than a man of his rank might have made it if he were still trying to hide behind courtesy. "Miss Ward, Lady Tamsin, will practice in the schoolroom at 4 o'clock. You agreed to attend as observer. I give you my word that you will not be treated as an employee, nor asked to perform forgiveness. A carriage will be sent only if you permit it." Arthur Lydgate, Westmere. Margaret stood in her lodging-house parlour with the note in one hand and her father's hornbook in the other, feeling the dangerous pull of a door not quite closed. Mrs. Bell, the landlady, pretended to dust the mantel while watching from the corner of her eye. "A duke's carriage is not a thing one ignores, Miss Ward. A duke's carriage is also not a reference. No, but it has wheels, and wheels are useful when one must return to the lion's den." Margaret folded the note. "I shall take a hired cab." Mrs. Bell sniffed approval. "Better. Lions respect those who arrive without being carried in their mouths." By the time Margaret reached Westmere House, the late afternoon light lay across the front steps like pale gauze. The butler received her not with the stiff pity of dismissal, but with careful formality. That told her Arthur had given instructions. It did not tell her whether the house had changed. Houses learned slowly. Mrs. Vale met her at the stair and gave a curtsy deeper than she had ever given while Margaret was employed there. Miss Ward, Lady Tamsin is in the schoolroom. His Grace is there as well. And Lady Venetia? Not at present. The words contained both relief and warning. Margaret climbed the stairs, with the hornbook held close, aware of every landing where a maid turned away too quickly, every familiar banister polished by hands that knew more than they said. When she entered the schoolroom, Tamsin sprang from her chair so quickly the primer slid to the floor. Miss Ward. She stopped halfway across the room and looked uncertainly toward her father, as though joy itself might require permission. Margaret felt that pause in her bones. She lowered herself slightly. Not enough to make a scene, only enough to meet the child's eyes. Lady Tamsin, may I take your hands? Tamsin rushed forward then, placing both small hands into Margaret's gloved ones. You came back. I came to hear you read, not to stay. The question opened a wound Margaret could not afford to show. Today, I came to hear you read. Arthur stood near the window, one hand resting on the back of a chair, his face controlled but not cold. He had removed himself from the center of the room, and Margaret noticed the choice. A duke accustomed to occupying space had made space instead. Miss Ward, he said, Your Grace. On the table lay Tamsin's copybook, several botanical labels, the scraped slate wrapped at its edges in clean paper, and a fresh primer opened to a passage Margaret did not recognize. Her eyes narrowed. That is not the page I assigned. Tamsin's fingers tightened. Arthur looked at the book. Lady Venetia sent it up this morning. She said it was from Mr. Palmer's recommended series. Margaret approached the table. The passage was simple enough in appearance. A moral paragraph about filial obedience and modest understanding. But the phrasing was oddly stiff. A child drilled in fear could stumble over its deliberate repetitions. A child already frightened of displeasing adults could fail spectacularly. Margaret looked at Tamsin. Have you practiced this? Tamsin nodded. With Lady Venetia. And did she tell you how to answer if your father asked whether you understood it? The child's lower lip trembled. Arthur moved, then stopped himself. Margaret saw the restraint. Good. Rescue too quickly, and Tamsin might never learn her own voice was allowed. Margaret set the hornbook on the table, not as evidence yet, but as comfort. We shall begin with what you know. Read this label, if you please. She handed Tamsin a folded slip from the Nature Words drawer. Tamsin glanced at her father, then read, faint but accurate. Primrose, found in the South Garden, April the 9th. Very good. Margaret gave one nod. Now this, fern, pressed by Ellen because the stem broke. Ellen, the nursery maid, who stood near the door, covered a smile. Arthur's eyes moved from the label to his daughter's face. He was watching not a performance, but a person. Margaret turned a page in the copybook. And this sentence? Tamsin read more slowly. The violet opens when the light is gentle. Her voice steadied on the last word. Margaret did not praise too much. Overpraise could feel like another form of display. You have remembered well, Arthur exhaled, so quietly, only Margaret seemed to hear it. Then the schoolroom door opened. Lady Venetia Sallow entered in pale blue, with Mr. Eustace Bracknell behind her, carrying a leather folder. How touching, she said, a rehearsal disguised as impartial observation. Tamsin went rigid. The change was immediate. Her shoulders rose, her chin lowered. Her hand crept toward the edge of the table, as if searching for a place to hold on. Margaret saw Arthur see it. That mattered. Lady Venetia, he said, you were not asked to attend this practice. No, but I was asked by conscience, dear Arthur. We cannot allow sentiment to govern education. Bracknell bowed. Your Grace, I have brought the preliminary certificate from Mr. Palmer's adviser. It may assist in clarifying what the household has been reluctant to confront. Margaret kept her gaze on Tamsin. Lady Tamsin, you need not read for Mr. Bracknell. Venetia laughed softly. There, you see, possessiveness masquerading as protection. Arthur's face hardened, but before he could speak, Venetia lifted the new primer. Come, Tamsin, show your father the passage you practiced. The child looked at Margaret in panic. Margaret's heart beat once, painfully. If she refused outright, Venetia would claim dependence. If she allowed the child to be frightened, the harm would continue before her eyes. So she chose the narrow road between. Lady Tamsin may decide whether she wishes to read. Venetia's smile thinned. Children do not decide instruction. No, Margaret said, but frightened children do reveal it. Bracknell made a note. Tamsin picked up the primer with both hands. Her eyes ran over the page. The room waited. A good child, she began, then stopped. Her breath hitched. A good child knows less than she thinks. Arthur's head lifted sharply. Margaret had not seen that sentence before. Tamsin continued, voice flattening into memorized fear. A good child doesn't question those above her. If she reads too proudly, she forgets her place. Silence. The words were not merely unsuitable. They were cruelly shaped. Margaret spoke gently. Tamsin, is that printed on the page? The child stared at the primer. Her mouth opened. No sound came. Venetia swept forward and took the book. She is confused because Miss Ward has filled her with vanity. That is precisely the decline we must correct. Give me the primer, Arthur said. Venetia hesitated. He held out his hand. Not a request. She gave it to him. He looked at the page. The printed passage did not contain those words. Tamsin, he said, and his voice was careful now, almost painfully careful. Who taught you that sentence? Tears spilled at last. Ornvi said if I read well, Papa won't send me where she wants. She said, I must be wrong prettily. Venetia's face changed by a fraction, then recovered. The child is inventing under pressure. Margaret stepped closer to Tamsin, but did not touch her yet. May I? She asked. Tamsin nodded and reached first. Margaret took the child's hand between both of hers. Arthur watched that simple permission as if it were a language he had never learned properly. Tamsin pulled a folded copybook page from the pocket of her pinafore. I wrote it, she whispered. So, I wouldn't forget which words were mine. Margaret unfolded it. The sentence was there in Tamsin's hand, shaky but clear. Aunt Fee says if I read well, Papa will not send me where she wants. Bracknell leaned forward. A child's private scribbling proves very little. Arthur turned to him. It proves enough to delay any certificate. Your Grace, no transfer will be signed. No new establishment will be considered. No adviser will examine my daughter until I understand why she has been taught to fear success. Venetia's eyes flashed. You are allowing a governess to govern your house. Arthur looked at Margaret then, not with dependence, not with command, but with the grave beginning of trust. No, I am allowing the truth to enter it. Margaret felt the words land softly and refused to let them carry her away. She still stood in a house that had injured her. The child's hand trembled inside hers. The man who had wounded her had begun to listen, but listening was not restoration. Lady Tamsin should rest, she said. This has been enough. Arthur nodded at once. Ellen, take her to the nursery. Stay with her. Tamsin clung for 1 second. Will you go again? Margaret bent close. I will not leave without saying goodbye to you. It was not the promise the child wanted. It was the only honest one Margaret could give. When Tamsin had gone, Venetia closed her fan with a soft snap. This indulgence will cost the child dearly. Arthur's answer came before Margaret's. No, Lady Venetia. The cost began when adults mistook obedience for health. Bracknell gathered his papers, his expression controlled but tight. Then perhaps tomorrow's certificate will bring necessary clarity. Margaret looked at the altered primer, the copybook page, and the hornbook resting under her palm. The mystery had shifted. It was no longer whether Tamsin could read. It was who needed her to fail, and how far they would go to make a frightened child appear broken before the world. The certificate arrived 3 days after Margaret Ward had watched Lady Tamsin Lydgate turn another person's cruelty into a child's trembling recitation. It came just before noon, carried by Mr. Eustace Bracknell in a stiff leather folder, and presented in the small morning room, because Lady Venetia Sallow had declared the schoolroom too emotionally charged for reasonable discussion. Margaret stood near the window with her gloved hands folded, not as a servant, not as a guest, but as the one person everyone wished to discuss without allowing her to answer. Arthur Lydgate stood by the mantel, the scraped slate wrapped in paper on the table beside him, Tamsin's copybook beneath it, and the child herself safely upstairs with Ellen under Mrs. Vale's watch. That much had changed. Not enough. Lady Venetia sat in a chair arranged to catch the light, pale and composed, as though concern had dressed itself in silk. "Your Grace," Bracknell began, drawing out the certificate with ceremonial care. "Mr. Palmer's adviser has reviewed the available account of Lady Tamsin's condition and confirms what her ladyship feared. The child exhibits signs of ungovernable attachment, irregular instruction, and nervous dependence upon Miss Ward's methods." Margaret heard the phrase before she saw the page. Ungovernable attachment, the same ugly construction, had appeared in the earlier memorandum, in the questions asked at the registry, and in the words Venetia had tried to wrap around a frightened child. It was not observation, it was architecture. Arthur took the certificate but did not sit. "This adviser has never met my daughter. He has reviewed the household report," Bracknell said. "A man of recognized educational judgment does not require prolonged exposure to identify improper influence." Margaret looked at him. How convenient for gentlemen who prefer conclusions to children. Venetia's fan opened with a soft whisper. "Miss Ward, must every exchange become a challenge?" "Only the exchanges in which a child is being made smaller on paper than she is in life." Arthur's eyes moved toward her. For a brief second Margaret saw approval there, or something near it, quickly restrained. He had learned caution around her dignity. That was progress. It was not yet trust. Bracknell placed a second sheet on the table. "The certificate recommends immediate removal from Miss Ward's influence and a period of structured correction outside London. Lady Tamsin should be placed where affection cannot be mistaken for authority." "And where would that be?" Arthur asked. Venetia answered before Bracknell could. "A private establishment near Richmond, discreet and well regarded. The proprietress has experience with sensitive children." "Sensitive," Margaret repeated. "That word has become very crowded." Venetia turned to her with a small smile. "It is not an insult to admit a child requires care beyond the capacities of one young woman. I agree. That is why I object to frightening her into failure and calling it care." Arthur looked down at the certificate. His face gave away very little, but Margaret had begun to notice the moments when stillness cost him effort. One line tightened beside his mouth. One thumb pressed against the edge of the page. He was not convinced by Bracknell, but neither had he fully stepped away from fear. "Miss Ward," he said, "the certificate claims Lady Tamsin has resisted instruction from anyone except you, because everyone else has asked her to prove she is not afraid before they teach her. It also claims her progress cannot be trusted because you selected the copybooks. Then ask Mrs. Vale where the copybooks were kept. Ask Ellen whether I altered dates. Ask Lady Tamsin to read from objects she wrote before this began." "Before what began?" Venetia asked. Margaret turned to her. "Before your concern required an audience." The fan stilled. For one dangerous moment, Venetia's softness thinned enough to show calculation beneath. Then she looked at Arthur, not Margaret. "You see how she speaks in your house. A governess who cannot remember rank will soon teach a child to forget it." The word rank entered the room like a blade laid politely on a table. Arthur's gaze lowered to the certificate again. Margaret waited. She hated herself for waiting. She had told him what to examine. She had shown him fear in his child, corrections in the wrong hand, dates that contradicted Bracknell, sentences Tamsin had been made to memorize. Yet the room still leaned toward his decision because he was a duke, and she was a woman without a reference. At last Arthur said, "I will not sign a transfer today." Relief moved through Margaret before she could stop it. Then he added, "But the examination will proceed before witnesses. If Lady Tamsin's true progress is as Miss Ward states, it will be shown. If not, I must consider what is safest for my daughter." The relief froze. Margaret looked at him. Really looked. "Suffest," she said quietly. Arthur heard the change. "Miss Ward." "No, Your Grace, I understand." His brow tightened. "I do not think you do. You want truth only when it is quiet, contained, and witnessed by people whose opinion cannot harm you." The words struck the room harder because she did not raise her voice. Bracknell's lips compressed. Venetia's eyes brightened with the pleased attention of someone watching an opponent bleed in exactly the expected place. Arthur stepped away from the mantel. "That is not what I said. It is what you are doing. There are accusations. There is a child. She is my child. Then believe what fear has done to her before fear performs badly in front of strangers." His face changed. Pain crossed it first, then pride rose to cover it. Margaret saw the covered zescent and knew she had lost the moment. Not the truth, perhaps, but the moment. "You ask me to dismiss every concern without process," he said. "No, I ask you not to make a frightened child stand trial, because adults have learned to write concern in elegant phrases." Venetia rose, wounded dignity arranged beautifully around her. "Arthur, this is intolerable. Miss Ward is not merely defending herself. She is challenging your judgment in front of your own advisers." "My judgment has been wrong before," he said. It was a quiet sentence. It should have been enough to soften the room. But he did not follow it where it needed to go. He looked back at Margaret with that controlled, strained expression. "The examination is in 3 days. You may attend." "May." The word landed between them with all the old distance inside it. Margaret drew herself upright. "I shall attend." His eyes searched hers, and for an instant she sensed he wanted to say something more human. Something without rank in it. But he did not. "I will send the carriage." "No." The answer came too quickly to disguise the wound. "I will arrive by my own means. Miss Ward, London gossip has already begun. It would be better if—" "Better for whom?" Silence. She picked up her reticule from the chair where Mrs. Vale had placed it. "I will not be hidden for your convenience, carried for your conscience, or summoned like evidence. If Lady Tamsin is to be made to read before witnesses, Then I will stand where she can see, at least, one face that is not waiting for her to fail. Arthur's face went still in the way that told her she had reached him. Not enough to change the decision. Enough to make it hurt. That was not my intention, he said. Intention is a comfortable refuge for people whose mistakes are survived by others. Bracknell looked down at his folder to hide a flicker of satisfaction. Venetia's voice softened. Miss Ward is distressed. Perhaps we should forgive the impertinence. Margaret turned toward her. You may keep your forgiveness, Lady Venetia. I have made no application for it. Mrs. Vale, standing near the door, lowered her eyes, but not before Margaret saw the flash of fierce approval there. Arthur saw it too. He saw, perhaps, that the loyalties in his house had not been where he assumed them to be. Still, he did not stop Margaret when she curtsied and walked out. He followed her only as far as the corridor, where the morning-room door remained open behind them, and propriety stood between them like a third person. Miss Ward. She paused. Your Grace, I meant to protect Tamsin from uncertainty. Then stop adding to it. And you? His voice lowered. What have I added to you? The question was so unexpected that for a second Margaret had no answer. She looked at him then, at the man who had begun to see but not yet learned how costly sight could be when it came late. You added hesitation where belief was needed. His hand moved slightly, as if he might reach for her sleeve, then stopped before the gesture became presumption. That restraint, small as it was, wounded her almost as much as it steadied her. He was learning. She could not afford to wait inside the lesson. Good day, Your Grace. She left him in the corridor with the certificate in one room, the scraped slate in another, and the knowledge that he had delayed injustice without yet choosing justice. Upstairs, unseen by both of them, Tamsin sat at the nursery table and copied the same sentence 3 times in a shaking hand. If I am wrong, they will send me away. If I am wrong, they will send me away. If I am wrong, they will send me away. And beneath it, in smaller letters almost too faint to read, she wrote one more line. Miss Ward says, truth does not stop being true when I am afraid. By the morning of the examination, Westmere House had dressed the schoolroom as though dignity could be arranged with chairs. 2 rows had been set near the windows for Lady Ashcombe, Mrs. Pell, the vicar's wife, and 3 other patronesses whose approval travelled through London faster than any formal notice. The Reverend Mr. Hallow stood near the cabinet with the uneasy expression of a man who had come to hear a child read and found himself invited to witness a trial. Mrs. Vale had placed herself beside the door. Ellen remained near the nursery passage, pale but steady. Mr. Bracknell stood with a fresh folder under one arm. Lady Venetia Sallow moved among the guests with lowered voice and lifted brows, giving the impression that sorrow had forced her into public duty. Arthur Lydgate watched all of it from the mantel. 3 days earlier, he had believed a public examination might settle uncertainty. Now, seeing the small chair placed at the center of the room, like a witness box, he understood Margaret Ward's warning too late. The child was not being examined. She was being exposed. When Margaret entered, the room shifted. Not loudly. Women like Margaret did not change aristocratic rooms by entrance alone. Yet every person present seemed to feel the moral inconvenience of her composure. She wore the same plain grey gown, clean and severe, and carried her father's hornbook in one gloved hand. She did not look at Arthur first. She looked at Tamsin. The child stood beside the schoolroom table in a white frock, her face so pale that her freckles seemed painted on. Margaret gave no dramatic greeting. she only inclined her head and said, "Good morning, Lady Tamsin." Tamsin's mouth trembled. "Good morning, Miss Ward." Venetia turned to the patronesses. "You see the attachment. It is touching, certainly, but not wholesome when a child cannot separate affection from learning." Margaret walked to the side of the room, exactly where she had said she would stand, not beside Arthur, not behind Tamsin, visible but not claiming the scene. Arthur noticed the precision and felt again the shame of how often he had mistaken her restraint for meekness. Mr. Bracknell opened his folder. For clarity, Lady Tamsin will read first from the standard passage selected by Mr. Palmer's advisor, then answer several questions to establish comprehension. "And who selected the advisor?" Margaret asked. Her voice was quiet. Every head turned. Bracknell smiled thinly. "The advisor's reputation is not in question." "That was not my question," Lady Ashcombe murmured behind her fan. Venetia's eyes flashed. Arthur nearly spoke, then stopped. Margaret had told him not to speak over truth merely because rank made it easier. Bracknell adjusted his spectacles. Lady Venetia supplied his name, as one familiar with sensitive children. "Thank you," Margaret said, and fell silent. The answer had been placed before the room like a small pin. Tamsin was handed the primer. Her hands shook so visibly that Mrs. Pell made a sympathetic sound. Venetia stepped closer. "Come, darling. A good child tries, even when she is confused." Tamsin looked at the page. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she began. "A good child knows less than she thinks." Arthur's fingers closed around the edge of the mantle. That sentence was not on the page. He knew it now. Margaret knew it. Tamsin knew it. But the patronesses did not. A good child doesn't question those above her. If she reads too proudly, she forgets her place. The words came out flat and memorized. Lady Ashcombe frowned. Reverend Hallow looked toward Arthur. Venetia placed one hand to her heart with perfect sorrow. "There, the poor dear has confused the passage again. This is the nervous dependence of which we spoke." Margaret did not move. "Lady Tamsin," she said gently, "may I ask you one question?" Bracknell interposed at once. "This examination is not under Miss Ward's direction." Arthur spoke then, but only to clear space. "Let the question be asked." Margaret looked at the child, not at her enemies. "Is that sentence printed in the book?" Tamsin looked down. Her breathing quickened. "I don't know. That is quite all right. Would you like to look with your finger, word by word?" Venetia laughed softly. "She will coach the child in front of us and call it mercy." Margaret turned to the patronesses, then let someone else hold the book. Reverend Hallow stepped forward. "I will if His Grace permits." Arthur nodded. The vicar held the primer open, and Tamsin, after one terrified glance at Venetia, placed her finger under the printed line. Her lips moved, her brow tightened. "It doesn't say it." Silence, small, sharp. Bracknell's expression hardened. "A child may import phrases from other lessons." "Indeed," Margaret said, "that is what I fear." She reached into the schoolroom cabinet and withdrew the tied packet of botanical labels. "Lady Tamsin, you need not recite. You may choose whether to read one of your own labels." Tamsin looked at Arthur. This time he answered not as Duke, but as father. "You may choose." The child reached for a label with 2 fingers. "Primrose, found in the South Garden, April the 9th. Her voice wavered, then held. Margaret did not praise too much. "Thank you. Another if you wish." Tamsin chose the next, Fern, pressed by Ellen because the stem broke. A faint, helpless smile crossed Ellen's face by the door. One of the patronesses leaned forward. "That is a good hand for 8. Venetia's fan snapped open, or an instructed performance. Margaret unfolded a third label and held it up for the room to see without surrendering it. This date is April the 3rd. Mr. Bracknell's memorandum states, Lady Tamsin had already declined in reading capacity by the first week of April, yet this label was written, dated, and corrected before then. Dates may be added, Bracknell said. Gum may be freshened. Children may be made to repeat. Then examine the gum, Margaret said. It has yellowed at the edge. The ink has faded where the sun reaches the cabinet drawer. If I fabricated it, I did so with unusual patience before knowing I would be accused. A whisper ran among the ladies. Arthur saw Venetia's fingers whiten around her fan. He also saw Tamsin watching Margaret, as if watching a candle survive wind. Miss Ward, Lady Ashcombe said, "Are you suggesting someone wished the child to appear deficient?" "I am suggesting Lady Tamsin has been asked to fear reading correctly." Bracknell stepped forward. "This is outrageous. A dismissed governess cannot be allowed to accuse a lady of rank by innuendo. I have accused no one by name." Margaret's eyes moved to Venetia. Not yet. The room froze. Venetia rose with remarkable grace. "Your Grace, this is precisely the danger. Miss Ward has turned a child's natural affection into influence, and now influence into attack. She is not defending Lady Tamsin. She is defending her own importance." Tamsin made a small choking sound. "No." Everyone looked at her. The child shrank, but Margaret did not move toward her. She waited. Tamsin gripped the edge of the table. "Miss Ward tells me I don't have to be clever for people who are watching." Venetia smiled sadly. "And yet you are performing for her now. That broke something." Tamsin dropped the label. "I don't want to go where you said. I don't want to be wrong prettily," Mrs. Pell gasped. Reverend Hallow looked appalled. Bracknell bent to gather the dropped label, but Arthur's voice stopped him. "Do not touch it." The command cracked through the schoolroom. Bracknell straightened slowly. Venetia turned to Arthur, still trusting the old habit of his fear. "Arthur, you must see that this scene proves the child is ungoverned." Arthur looked at Tamsin, then at Margaret, standing alone, with one hand resting on the hornbook, and the other clenched so tightly in her glove that the seams strained. He understood then that the examination had reached its true questions. Not whether Tamsin could read, not whether Margaret could defend herself, whether he would let fear make another decision while the woman he had wronged stood under public suspicion. He crossed the room. Every eye followed him. He stopped beside Margaret, close enough for the room to understand, far enough to ask, "Miss Ward." She looked up. Her face was calm, but her eyes were bright with held pain. "Your Grace." Arthur offered his arm, not seized, not commanded, offered. The schoolroom inhaled. Margaret looked at his sleeve, then at his face. In that pause lay the insult in the schoolroom, the registry, the lodging-house apology, the corridor wound, and the child trembling before witnesses. He did not speak over the pause. At last, Margaret placed her gloved hand on his arm, lightly, deliberately, freely. The contact was proper enough for any drawing room and intimate enough to silence this one. Arthur turned to the guests. "Miss Ward will not be made small in my house again." Venetia's face went white beneath its careful powder. Bracknell closed his folder with a stiff snap. "Your Grace may regret allowing sentiment to displace procedure. Procedure that begins by frightening a child and ends by slandering her teacher is not procedure," Arthur said. "It is concealment dressed in respectable language." Margaret's hand did not tighten on his arm, but it did not withdraw. Tamsin saw it. Her shoulders lowered for the first time all morning. Lady Ashcombe looked from the botanical labels to the primer to Venetia's frozen smile. "It seems," she said carefully, "that further inquiry is required." "It will be had," Arthur answered. Then, lower, for Margaret alone, "I should have stood sooner." Margaret kept her gaze ahead. "Yes, Your Grace, you should have. The words should have shamed him." They did, yet beneath the shame was something steadier. She had taken his arm not because she had forgiven him, and not because she needed his rank to stand. She had taken it because in that moment, before the same room that had tried to diminish her, he had finally offered support without ownership. Behind them, on the schoolroom floor, the fallen label lay face up. "Primrose, found in the South Garden, April the 9th. A child's small, dated truth, waiting for someone to stop calling it performance. The morning after the public lesson, the Westmere schoolroom looked less like a chamber of instruction than a room where truth had been disturbed and every object had been ordered not to move. Arthur had given that order before breakfast. The fallen primrose label had been lifted only by Mrs. Vale, placed between two sheets of clean paper, and laid beside the scraped slate in the locked drawer of his study. The primer from which Tamsin had recited words not printed on the page remained on the schoolroom table, marked with a ribbon at the passage. The copybooks were stacked by date. The botanical labels had been removed from the cabinet only, long enough for Margaret Ward to examine them in the full light by the window. She stood there now with her sleeves plain, her gloves set aside, and her father's hornbook resting near her elbow. She had returned not as governess and not as guest, but as the one person in the house who could distinguish a frightened child's mistake from an adult's design. Arthur remained near the hearth, deliberately behind her line of work, so he would not appear to supervise what he barely understood. Mr. Simon Aveling, the independent writing master summoned from Russell Square, had arrived with a magnifying glass, a packet of comparison sheets, and the grave caution of a man who knew aristocratic households preferred answers that did not embarrass them. He had been told he would be paid whether his conclusion pleased anyone or not. That, too, had been Margaret's requirement. "The child's natural hand is here, Mr." Aveling said, tapping Tamsin's February copybook. "Uneven pressure, but honest. The downstrokes lean right. The cross on the small t is late and short, quite ordinary for 8. Margaret nodded. "And the altered lines?" Mr. Aveling bent over the April ledger. "Not the same hand." Whoever inserted these remarks attempted childish irregularity, but the spacing gives it away. Adults pretending to be careless often forget that children are careless with rhythm, not calculation. Arthur's eyes moved to the ledger. Read the altered remark. Mr. Aveling adjusted his spectacles. "Lady Tamsin resists all discipline unless Miss Ward is present. Shows ungovernable dependence. Requires removal from current influence." Margaret did not react outwardly, but Arthur saw the small tightening at the corner of her mouth. That phrase had stalked her from memorandum to registry to certificate, dressing malice as educational concern. "And the ink?" she asked, different from the ink Miss Ward used in the dated corrections. "Similar black, but with a brown settling at the edge. It was applied later." "Can you prove later?" Arthur asked. The writing master looked at him plainly. "I can state the physical appearance. Proof is a word lawyers like better than teachers. The page shows one hand beneath, another above, and different ink. That is as far as honest craft goes." "Honest craft is welcome here," Margaret said. Arthur felt the rebuke without resenting it. He deserved any room in which honesty had to be invited back, like an injured guest. Margaret lifted one of the botanical labels. This is the point. Lady Venetia called recent fabrication. Mr. Aveling held it close. The gum has browned at the corner. The ink is faded where light would reach it if stored near a window. Blotting sand has pressed into the strokes. Not impossible to imitate, but unlikely for a hasty fraud. And if someone claimed Miss Ward prepared it in anticipation, then Miss Ward is accused of plotting her own dismissal weeks before she knew she would be dismissed. A silence followed. It was not dramatic. It was worse. It was practical. Arthur looked at Margaret, and she looked down at Tamsin's copybook rather than meet him. He had begun to understand that his remorse was an emotion, while her danger was a circumstance. Emotion could not feed her, house her, or restore her name. Mr. Aveling packed several comparison notes into a folder and sealed them with his plain personal seal. I shall write my statement by this evening. I advise that no one else handle the ledger without witness. Mrs. Vale will hold the key, Arthur said. Margaret glanced at him then. The glance was brief, surprised, and gone. He had not placed the key in his own pocket. He had placed it with the woman who had preserved the slate. Small repair, perhaps, but real. When the writing master left, the schoolroom seemed to grow larger and lonelier around them. From the nursery came the faint sound of Ellen coaxing Tamsin through a quiet luncheon. Venetia had withdrawn to the drawing-room under the pretense of a headache. Bracknell had not returned since the examination, though a note had arrived before noon stating that he expected all materials connected to the child's education to be treated as household property and not removed by unauthorized persons. Margaret had read the note once and said only, "He is afraid of paper that answers back." Now she stood with both hands on the table, studying the copybook pages one more time. Arthur saw the fatigue in her shoulders before she straightened it away. "Miss Ward," he said, "you should sit. I have been dismissed, slandered, summoned, examined, and contradicted. I do not think sitting will improve the situation." "No, but it may improve your strength. My strength is not the matter under review. It is to me." She went still. The words had come too quickly, too honestly, and he saw her guard rise because honesty from him had not yet earned safety. He took one step back, giving her more space instead of less. "Forgive me." That sounded like a claim. It was not meant as one. Margaret turned the copybook closed. Your Grace is learning to correct himself before others must do it for him. Too slowly? Yes. He almost smiled, not with amusement, with relief that she would still tell him the truth without decorating it. She looked toward the nursery door. Lady Tamsin should not be questioned again today. She will not be, not by you, not by Lady Venetia, not by a physician called in to make fear sound like illness. Arthur's jaw tightened. I have sent word that no physician is to attend unless Tamsin is physically unwell. Good. She reached for the hornbook, then paused when he spoke again. After Eleanor died, Tamsin would not speak to me for nearly a month. Margaret did not turn, but she did not leave. That was permission of the only kind he deserved. He continued carefully. She would sit with her doll near the window and answer every question with one word. I thought grief had made her fragile. I thought anything strong enough to win her confidence might also take her from me. Margaret looked back then. Her expression was no longer merely guarded. It was attentive, but unsparing. So when she loved me, you feared me. Arthur took the blow because it was true. Yes, the word sounded smaller than a duke should sound. It was the most honest word he had spoken all week. And when Lady Venetia placed a paper in my hand that made your care look like control, I believed it because it suited my fear. You believed rank before evidence. I believed fear before either. Margaret's eyes softened by a fraction, then steadied again. That explains the wound, Your Grace. It does not close it. I know. Do you? I am trying to know it without asking you to comfort me for the shame of it. That stopped her. Outside, carriage wheels passed along the street below, faint through the glass. Somewhere in the house, a door closed and opened. The schoolroom held them in a quiet that was not yet peace. That is the first sensible thing you have said about remorse, she said at last. Arthur bowed his head once. I harmed you because I was afraid. That is not a defense. Margaret's fingers rested on the hornbook's worn handle. He wondered if she knew how often that small object kept her from showing what she felt. No, she said, it is not. What would repair look like? Truth first. Not your admiration, not your guilt, not protection wrapped around silence. Truth and after truth. Her gaze met his, steady enough to make evasion impossible. After truth, we shall see whether anything remains that was not built on the wrong ground. It should have discouraged him. Instead, because he was beginning to understand her, it steadied him. She had not promised forgiveness. She had not denied possibility. She had placed the future where it belonged, beyond proof and beyond public repair. Ellen appeared in the doorway, pale and breathless. Miss Ward, Your Grace, Lady Tamsin asks if she may show something. Margaret was already moving. Arthur followed only after. She glanced back and gave a small nod that permitted his presence. In the nursery, Tamsin sat at the little table, with red-rimmed eyes and a folded blue card pressed beneath both palms. I hid it, she whispered. I know I wasn't to hide things. Margaret knelt beside the chair, but did not touch her. You may tell us what it is when you are ready. Tamsin slid the card forward. On it, in an adult hand, were the very wrong answers she had spoken in the schoolroom. A good child knows less than she thinks. A good child does not question those above her. If she reads too proudly, she forgets her place. Arthur felt the room narrow to that small blue square. Tamsin looked at him, terror and hope fighting in her face. Aunt Fee said, I must practice it. She said, if I got it right, everyone would see I needed to go. Margaret did not look at Arthur. She looked only at the child, but her earlier words filled the nursery like judgment. Truth first, and for the first time, Arthur understood that truth had not entered his house like a weapon. It had been hiding in the hands of an 8-year-old girl, waiting for an adult. Brave enough not to call it disobedience, the blue card did not look dangerous enough to have frightened a child into betraying her own mind. It was only a square of stiff paper, no larger than a calling card, the color of a faded summer ribbon, with 3 sentences written in a careful adult hand that tried too hard to appear instructive. Yet when Arthur Lydgate saw it lying on the nursery table beneath Tamsin's trembling fingers, he felt the full architecture of the cruelty at last. This was not confusion. It was not feminine nervousness, nor childish invention, nor a governess's sentimental exaggeration. Someone had taken the obedience expected from a little girl and sharpened it into a lesson against truth. Margaret Ward remained kneeling beside Tamsin's chair, one hand open on the table, close enough to comfort, not close enough to command. She had not snatched up the card. She had not cried out in triumph. She waited for the child to remain the center of her own confession. Arthur understood the restraint only because he had failed it so often. Where was it hidden? He asked, and the care in his own voice sounded unfamiliar. Tamsin pointed toward the nursery hearth, behind the screen, not in the fire, behind the brass foot, where the wallpaper curls. Ellen moved instinctively toward the hearth, but Margaret lifted her eyes. "May Ellen look, Lady Tamsin?" The child nodded. Only then did the nursery maid go to the screen and draw it back. A narrow gap showed where the old wallpaper had loosened, near the skirting board. There was dust there, and a small crescent of blue where another corner of the card must have rubbed against plaster. Ellen looked back, pale. "It was tucked there, Your Grace, hidden but not lost." Arthur bent and saw on the lower edge of the card a tiny stamped mark, nearly blurred by handling. Bracknell and Lowe, Stationers, Chancery Lane. The name struck with a clean, practical force. "Bracknell," he said. Margaret looked at the mark. Not proof that he wrote it, but proof that the card did not come from a child's lesson drawer. "His cousin owns a stationer's shop near Chancery Lane," Ellen whispered before fear could stop her. Then she covered her mouth. Arthur turned to her. "You will not be punished for telling the truth." The maid looked as if she wanted to believe him, and did not yet know whether dukes could be trusted with such promises. That, too, he had earned. He folded the blue card between two sheets of clean paper. "Mrs. Vale will place this in my dispatch box with the slate, the labels, and Mr. Aveling's notes." Tamsin's eyes widened. "Will Aunt V know?" "Not from you," Arthur said, "and not tonight." Margaret's gaze softened toward the child. "You have done enough for one day." "Did I do wrong hiding it?" Tamsin asked. The question was so small that the room seemed to bend around it. Margaret's face changed, not dramatically, but as a candle changes when a hand shields it from wind. "No, my dear, you kept hold of a truth until someone was ready to protect it." Tamsin began to cry, then, not with the wildness of fear, but with the exhausted grief of a child who had been allowed to stop pretending. She reached for Margaret without asking, and Margaret received her, one arm around the small shoulders, the other hand smoothing nothing, fixing nothing, only staying. Arthur stood uselessly beside them for a moment, and for once did not mistake his uselessness for insult. Some forms of comfort were not his to give first. When Mrs. Vale came, she brought the dispatch box herself, and locked the blue card inside while Arthur, Margaret, and Ellen watched. The key remained with Arthur, but he wrote the contents on a sheet, signed it, and asked Mrs. Vale to witness the list. Margaret saw the act and said nothing. Her silence did not absolve him. It recorded that he had learned one more necessary thing. That evening, after Tamsin had finally fallen asleep with Ellen in the adjoining room, and Mrs. Vale posted like a quiet guard in the passage, the schoolroom lamps burned low. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. Margaret sat at the schoolroom table, the hornbook before her, but her hand rested not on it, but near the empty place where the blue card had lain earlier. Arthur stood by the door for several seconds before entering, not because propriety required such distance, with the door open and the housekeeper nearby, but because he no longer trusted himself to fill rooms, simply because they belonged to him. "May I come in?" he asked. Margaret looked up. Wariness had drawn faint shadows beneath her eyes, yet she sat straight, always straight. "It is your schoolroom, Your Grace." "That was not what I asked." A brief silence followed. Then she inclined her head. "Yes." He came only as far as the opposite side of the table. "Mrs. Vale has the copy of the evidence list. Mr. Aveling's statement is expected tomorrow morning. I have sent no word to Bracknell. He will send word to you. Likely, and Lady Venetia, she believes Tamsin is resting after an emotional disturbance." Margaret's mouth tightened. That phrase again. Disturbance always seems to belong to the person harmed, never the person who caused it. Arthur sat only after she gave the smallest gesture toward the chair. The permission humbled him. He accepted the chair as he should have accepted her judgment from the beginning, with care. "I nearly sent her away," he said. Margaret did not answer. "Not in action, perhaps. I delayed. I questioned. I hesitated. But in my mind, I had already imagined that removing her might be safer than admitting. I did not know what was happening under my own roof." He looked toward the nursery passage. "My daughter was taught to fear being right." "Yes, and you told me before I was brave enough to hear it." "I told you because she could not." He let the sentence settle. "When you stood in this room with those patronesses watching, I thought you were defending your reputation." Margaret's eyes lifted. "I was." "Yes, but not only that. A woman without reputation has little power to protect a child in a great house. My name and her safety were not separate matters." Arthur bowed his head. "I should have understood. You should have believed." The answer came at once. It was not cruel. It was worse. It was exact. "Yes." The rain thickened at the window. Somewhere below, a footman crossed the hall, the sound softened by carpets and distance. Arthur looked down at his hands. They had signed leases, letters, settlements, dismissals, condolences. They had accepted documents because documents were easier than tears. "Miss Ward, when I was a boy, my father allowed a companion into my mother's rooms after her long illness. She read letters for my mother, managed small comforts, soothed fears. When my mother died, that woman tried to sell private correspondence to settle her brother's debts. My father paid, then never spoke her name again. I was 17. I learned the wrong lesson and have spent years pretending it was wisdom." Margaret listened without softness, but without impatience. "You learned that intimacy could become leverage." "Yes, and when Lady Tamsin loved me, you saw leverage." He shut his eyes briefly. "I did. That was not my doing. No, it was mine." When he opened his eyes, she was watching him with an expression that made him feel seen and judged in equal measure. "I am not telling you this so you will pity me," he said. "I know. Nor to ask you to excuse me." "Good." A breath almost escaped him. Not laughter, not relief, but something close to the first honest warmth he had felt all day. "You are severe, Miss Ward." "I am tired, Your Grace." That stripped the moment bare. He saw then that beneath her composure was exhaustion, not weakness, not collapse, the human cost of being dignified in rooms determined to misread dignity as pride. He placed his hand on the table, palm upward, not near enough to touch her, unless she chose it. "May I offer this?" Her gaze dropped to his hand. The room held very still. This was not a ballroom gesture. It was not rescue before witnesses. It was a question in a schoolroom after a child had finally slept. Margaret looked at the open door, then at Mrs. Vale's shadow beyond it, then back at him. "Why?" "Because you have carried truth through rooms where I made it heavier. Because I cannot undo that tonight. Because I would like, if you permit it, to sit beside one honest thing without turning it into command." Her face changed, only a little. Enough. Slowly, she placed her gloved hand in his. The contact was light at first, almost formal. Then, after one breath, her fingers settled more fully against his palm. Arthur did not close his hand until she had done so. When he did, it was not possession. It was answer. "I wanted belief before evidence frightened you into it," she said. "I know. I wanted you to hear me when I was only a governess with a trembling child and no paper to prove I wasn't lying. I know." Her fingers tightened once. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but not refusal. Arthur held her hand as if it were a trust he had been given too late and must not mishandle again. In the nursery beyond the passage, Tamsin slept with the blue card locked away. The false sentences no longer pressed beneath her palms. In the schoolroom, beside the worn hornbook and the quiet lamps, Margaret and Arthur sat without speaking for several minutes, hand in hand, while the rain washed the windows of a house that was beginning, painfully, to learn the difference between silence and peace. Lady Venetia Sallow sent for Margaret Ward at 2 o'clock the next afternoon, and the note was so exquisitely phrased that its threat could almost have passed for concern. Miss Ward, as distressing misunderstandings have multiplied beyond all proportion. I beg the favour of a private word before more harm is done to Lady Tamsin's peace. I shall await you in the small schoolroom parlour. V. Sallow. Margaret read it once in her lodging-house room, once more beside the window, and then folded it with the care one gave to something that might later need to be remembered. Exactly. She did not mistake the word private. Women like Lady Venetia did not seek privacy because they valued honesty. They sought it because truth had fewer witnesses there. Margaret tucked the note into her reticule, took her father's hornbook from the table, and asked Mrs. Bell to send a message to Westmere House before she departed. By the time Margaret arrived, Westmere House had settled into that strange afternoon quiet when servants moved softly and family scandals pretended to be rest. Mrs. Vale met her not at the main staircase, but at the side passage near the schoolroom wing. "Your message reached me, Miss Ward." "Thank you. I would be grateful if you remained close enough to hear if I call." The housekeeper's eyes sharpened. "I shall remain closer than that. Not inside the room unless invited. Lady Venetia must not be able to say I staged an audience." Mrs. Vale gave the faintest nod. "The adjoining schoolroom door sticks if left open by an inch. It has done so for years." Margaret almost smiled. How fortunate. The small schoolroom parlour had once been used by visiting tutors and nursery guests. It held a round table, 2 chairs, a locked glass cabinet of old primers, and a narrow door connecting to the larger schoolroom. Margaret entered to find Lady Venetia standing near the window in lavender silk, turned slightly toward the light as if even manipulation deserved good illumination. "Miss Ward," she said, "how sensible of you to come." Margaret placed the hornbook on the table before removing her gloves. "I understood you wished to speak privately. For your sake. Then let us be brief. My sake has been much discussed by people who do not own it." Venetia's smile tightened. "You mistake yourself if you think a few labels, a nervous child, and His Grace's current guilt will secure your future. I came to hear what you wished to say, not what you wished me to fear." "Very well." Venetia crossed to the table and set down a folded paper. A reference, glowing, if perhaps not entirely precise. "I am prepared to state that your departure from Westmere House occurred by mutual arrangement, and that your instruction, while unsuitable for Lady Tamsin's temperament, was diligent. With that, you may find a respectable post in the country." Margaret looked at the paper, but did not touch it. "And in exchange, you will leave London. You will not write to Tamsin. You will not attend further examinations, inquiries, or sentimental displays. You will allow a family to manage its own child." "You mean you will allow yourself to manage her?" Venetia's eyes chilled. "Do not be vulgar. Control is vulgar when dressed as concern. Control is necessary when a child's fortune, position, and future are at stake." There it was, a corner of truth showing beneath silk. Margaret kept her voice even. "Lady Tamsin's fortune?" Venetia's hand moved slightly, then stilled. "Do not pretend innocence. Her mother's arrangements left funds for education and household establishment. Funds that can be properly directed only if Tamsin is placed under suitable care, not under a governess who teaches her to mistrust her relations. Suitable care near Richmond, a private establishment of excellent reputation, controlled by your indebted relatives. Venetia's nostrils flared. She recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. You have been listening to servants. Servants hear footsteps. Children hear threats. Governesses learn to read both. Venetia leaned closer. You are a poor woman, Miss Ward. A poor woman with no family powerful enough to shield her if society decides she made improper use of a grieving duke and a motherless child. Take the reference. Take the money. From a small reticule on her wrist, she withdrew a sealed packet and placed it beside the paper. It struck the table with the soft weight of coin or banknotes. Begin again somewhere you can still be pitied respectably. Margaret felt no temptation. That surprised her less than it would have once. Hunger frightened her. Disgrace frightened her. Yet the thing Venetia offered was worse than both. It was a purchased silence that would teach Tamsin the final lesson of cowardice. No. Venetia stared. Do not be theatrical. I am being exact. You think His Grace will marry gratitude to justice. You think he will make you duchess because you held a child's hand and made him ashamed. The words were intended to wound. They struck, but not where Venetia aimed. Margaret's feelings for Arthur had become a dangerous, quiet thing, but she did not confuse them with rescue. I think nothing of the kind. Then what do you want? Lady Tamsin safe, my name restored, the truth spoken where the lie was heard. Venetia laughed once, softly. Truth, such a parish word. Margaret picked up her gloves. Then we are finished. Not quite. Venetia's voice sharpened. There is still the hornbook. Margaret's hand paused over it. What of it? You do not even know, do you? A gleam entered Venetia's expression, the satisfaction of a woman who had kept one blade back. The late Duchess was sentimental near the end. She wrote small instructions, hid them like relics, trusted the wrong people. There was an original educational report. Not Bracknell's certificate. Hers. A foolish page tucked where no one would value it, unless one knew her habits. Margaret's pulse slowed. Inside the hornbook backing. Venetia went still. The guess had been too accurate. Margaret had not known it that morning. But when Venetia's eyes moved to the hornbook, the truth moved with them. You truly are clever, Venetia said. That will make your ruin less forgivable. The connecting door opened behind her. Arthur Lydgate stood in the schoolroom doorway, his face pale with controlled fury. Mrs. Vale was visible beyond him, rigid and grave. Margaret did not turn quickly. She had known the door was ajar. She had known Mrs. Vale would be close. She had not known whether Arthur would come in time, or whether he would believe before every proof lay complete. Now he stood there, and something in the room changed its allegiance. Lady Venetia, he said, step away from the table. Venetia's hand flew to her throat. Arthur, this is not what it appears. For once, I believe it is precisely what it appears. You listened at a door. Yes. The admission was cold, clean, and stripped of aristocratic vanity, because Miss Ward has been threatened too often in rooms arranged to leave her unwitnessed. Venetia's eyes glittered. She trapped me. Margaret turned then. I left the door open. You chose what to say. Arthur crossed the room, but did not stand before Margaret. He stopped beside her, near enough to make his support visible, not near enough to claim her voice. Miss Ward will not be threatened in my house again. Venetia's mask slipped fully for the first time. Your house, without women like me, This house would have drowned in mourning, while you hid behind ledgers and silence. Perhaps, Arthur said, but that does not give you my daughter. The words landed with finality. Venetia looked from him to Margaret, measuring, recalculating, already searching for the next audience. Then let us have witnesses, she said. Let the patronesses return. Let your precious governess explain why a child would lie, why a duke would listen at doors, why a poor woman kept herself at the center of a noble household. Let us clarify everything publicly. Arthur's mouth hardened. We shall, good. Venetia gathered her skirts, and when sentiment collapses under scrutiny, do not say I did not warn you. She swept toward the door, but paused near Margaret. Women like you should learn when an offer is mercy. Margaret held her gaze. Women like me have spent our lives learning the difference between mercy and purchase. Venetia left. Mrs. Vale followed at a distance, not to serve her, but to ensure she touched nothing on the way out. For several seconds after the door closed, the parlor was silent. The sealed packet and false reference still lay on the table. The hornbook rested beside them, worn, plain, and suddenly more dangerous than either. Arthur looked at it, then at Margaret. You knew I might hear. I knew Mrs. Vale would. And me, she drew a breath. I hoped you would choose to believe what you heard before the page was opened. His face changed. Not triumph, not relief. Something more vulnerable. I did. The words moved between them, quiet and undeniable. Margaret's composure, held too long through accusation, bribery, and insult, finally faltered. Not much, only enough for her hand to tremble once against the table. Arthur saw it and did not reach at once. He had learned the cost of assuming. May I hold you? He asked. The question undid more than any command could have done. Margaret looked at him, at the man who had once made her leave with nothing but dignity, and who now stood waiting for permission as if her answer mattered more than his need to comfort. She could have said no. He would have accepted it. That was why she stepped forward. His arms came around her carefully, not enclosing a possession, but receiving a choice. For one breath, she remained stiff. Then, her hands gripped the front of his coat, and the last of her strength gave way into the safety she had not asked for and had finally been offered without price. Arthur bowed his head near her hair, silent, steady, asking nothing more. In the quiet schoolroom parlor, with the door open and the truth waiting inside an old hornbook, Margaret allowed herself to be held. Not rescued, not bought, held, and beyond the wall in the nursery. Tamsin slept without knowing that the woman who had taught her courage had just refused the price of silence. The old hornbook was opened the next morning on the schoolroom table, not by force, not in haste, and not in secret. Margaret Ward insisted upon all three conditions before she allowed Arthur Lydgate to touch the loosened backing again. Mrs. Vale stood at one side with her household keys and a clean sheet of paper for recording what was found. Ellen waited near the nursery door, ready to take any message to Tamsin, but forbidden, kindly and firmly, to bring the child into the room until the adults had finished with the dangerous business of proof. The windows had been opened to the mild spring air, and the smell of rain-washed stone came up from the courtyard below. On the table lay the objects gathered over the past days. The scraped slate wrapped at the edges, Tamsin's copybook, the botanical labels, Mr. Aveling's sealed statement, the false certificate, the blue lesson card with the Chancery Lane stationer's mark, and Lady Venetia's abandoned packet of money and false reference. The hornbook rested among them, smaller than all the papers and stronger than most. Margaret stood before it with gloved hands folded, though Arthur could see the strain in her fingers. "You are certain?" he asked. She looked at him. "No, but certainty has been used against Lady Tamsin and against me too often. Care will have to do." That answer, like so many of hers, corrected him without insult. He bowed his head. "Then we proceed with care." Mrs. Vale dipped her pen. "Present in the Westmere schoolroom. His Grace the Duke of Westmere, Miss Margaret Ward, Mrs. Vale, housekeeper. Time 10:30 in the morning." Margaret touched the hornbook's worn handle once, as if asking pardon from the father who had left it to her. "My father would have scolded me for not noticing the backing sooner." "Why?" Arthur asked softly. He believed old teaching tools kept more than lessons. Names, scraps, prayers, bills. Poor people use every inch of a thing. With a thin ivory paper knife from the writing table, Arthur eased the lifted edge at the back. He did not tear. The paste, long dried and loosened by age, released with a faint crackle. Margaret's breath caught, but she did not reach to stop him. A folded paper, no larger than a lady's visiting card, lay flat inside the shallow space between backing and board. It had yellowed at the crease. Arthur stepped back at once. "You should take it." Margaret looked at him sharply. He had not said, "I shall." He had not said, "Allow me." He had remembered that the object was hers, and that the evidence had survived in her keeping without her knowledge. She lifted the paper with 2 fingers and placed it on the table. Mrs. Vale leaned forward, pen ready. Condition: folded, aged, intact, no visible tearing. Arthur's mouth tightened with grim approval. "Thank you, Mrs. Vale." Margaret opened the page. The handwriting struck Arthur first. Eleanor's hand again, delicate in shape and unyielding in purpose. Margaret read silently. Colour left her face by degrees. "Read it aloud if you choose," Arthur said. "Not if I command it." She swallowed once. "I choose." Her voice was steady, but the room heard the effort beneath it. Lady Tamsin's instruction must not be altered to satisfy relations who prefer obedience to comprehension. If removal from Westmere House is ever proposed, it must not occur without 2 independent opinions: Mrs. Vale's account of the child's habits and Miss Margaret Ward's written report of her progress. Lady Venetia Sallow has shown excessive interest in making the child appear deficient when she is merely shy before display. I ask that my daughter be protected from those who would call fear a defect and use it to direct her future. Mrs. Vale's pen stopped. The housekeeper's face had gone very still. Arthur felt his dead wife's words move through the room and take their rightful place among the living. Not a ghost, a witness. Margaret laid the page down beside the blue card. She knew. "Yes," Arthur said, and the word cost him. "She knew enough to warn me, and I did not find the warning because I let others arrange the schoolroom after she died. You were grieving. I was absent while present. That is not the same as grief." Margaret looked at him then. Something in her expression shifted, not toward forgiveness exactly, but toward recognition. He was no longer using sorrow as a locked door. Mrs. Vale resumed writing, carefully recording the words. "This must go into the dispatch box," Margaret said, "with a copy made by someone neutral." "Mr. Aveling can witness a copy," Arthur said, "and Reverend Hallow. Not Bracknell, never Bracknell again." The firmness of that answer satisfied neither justice nor anger, but it steadied the room. Arthur gathered the evidence only after each item had been named aloud and recorded. He placed the page in his dispatch box last, between the writing master's statement and the blue card. Mrs. Vale locked the box and noted the time. When she left to summon Mr. Aveling and send a message to Reverend Hallow, The schoolroom remained open, the door wide, the house awake around them. Margaret stayed at the table, the hornbook before her, now hollowed and changed, though still whole. Arthur stood across from her, separated by the object that had carried a dead mother's warning and a poor clergyman's patience through years of silence. "I will not ask forgiveness before this is restored publicly," he said. "I will not ask you to let my remorse stand in place of your name." Margaret's fingers traced the edge of the hornbook. "That is wise. It is late." Yes, he accepted that, as he had learned to accept truth from her without demanding softness as payment. Tomorrow, Lady Venetia and Bracknell will expect to control the room. They have controlled many rooms. Not this one. Margaret lifted her eyes. "Do not say that because you are Duke of Westmere. I am saying it because you will lead the correction, if you are willing. Tamsin's labels, her copybook, the slate, the blue card, Eleanor's page. I will not turn your evidence into my performance." The words entered her slowly. He saw the moment they reached the part of her that had been forced to stand alone too often. "And if I falter," she asked, "then I shall stand beside you, not before you." Silence spread between them, deep and alive. Margaret touched his sleeve. It was a small thing, smaller even than the brush of fingers over the hornbook days before. But this time it was no accident. She chose it. Arthur went still, not because he feared the touch, but because he understood how much trust it cost. "Truth has already begun," she said. His heart seemed to answer before his mind did. "Margaret." Her name came without title, softer than he intended, but not careless. She did not correct him. She did not remove her hand. He looked toward the open door, toward the proper distance of servants and witnesses beyond, then back to her. "May I kiss you?" The question changed the air, not with scandal, with consequence. Margaret's hand remained on his sleeve. Her gaze searched his face, and he let himself be searched. There could be no command here, no gratitude mistaken for consent, no loneliness dressing itself as tenderness. Only her answer. "Yes," she said. He came around the table slowly enough that she might step back. She did not. He touched her only after her face lifted toward his. The kiss was gentle, brief, and solemn, with everything they had not yet earned and everything they had begun to repair. It did not close the wound. It did not settle the future. It simply told the truth in another language, one neither of them had permission to speak until now. When he drew back, Margaret's eyes were bright, but her voice remained steady. "I am afraid to love a man who once did not see me." Arthur felt the words enter him more deeply than any accusation. "Then I must spend whatever time I am given seeing you rightly." She looked down at the hornbook, then at the locked dispatch box where Eleanor's page waited among the proof. "Tomorrow first." "Tomorrow first," he agreed. From the corridor came Mrs. Vale's returning step, brisk and practical, restoring the world around them. Margaret moved away before the housekeeper entered, not in shame, but in composure. Arthur did not follow. He had asked. She had answered. That was enough for the moment. On the table, the hornbook lay open to its hidden hollow, no longer merely a lesson from Margaret's father, nor merely a relic of poverty and patience. It had become the place where a mother's warning, a child's fear, a woman's dignity, and a duke's late humility finally met on the same page. By 11 o'clock the next morning, the Westmere schoolroom had become the one room in London where silence could no longer pretend to be peace. The chairs had been placed in 2 careful rows as before, but nothing else belonged to Lady Venetia's design now. Mrs. Vale stood beside the locked dispatch box. Reverend Hallow had come with his wife and a grave face. Lady Ashcombe, Mrs. Pell, and the other patronesses sat near the windows, their gloves folded, their eyes watchful. Mr. Simon Aveling, the writing master, waited at the table with his sealed statement. Ellen stood close to the nursery door, ready to take Tamsin away if the child faltered. Mr. Eustace Bracknell entered last, polished and pale, with Lady Venetia Sallow beside him in dark blue silk, her expression arranged into injured dignity. Arthur Lydgate stood not at the mantel this time, but beside his daughter's small chair. Tamsin sat with both hands in her lap. Margaret Ward stood at the schoolroom table with her father's hornbook before her, and every accusation that had been thrown at her waiting to be answered by proof. Arthur looked once at Margaret. She did not smile. She did not need encouragement. She needed the room. He gave it to her. "Lady Venetia," he said, "you asked that matters be clarified before witnesses. We are assembled." Venetia inclined her head. "Painfully so, Arthur. I had hoped family distress might yet be spared spectacle." Margaret's voice came quiet and clear. Lady Tamsin was made a spectacle first. A murmur stirred among the ladies. Bracknell opened his folder. Miss Ward begins, as usual, by appealing to sentiment. Arthur did not move. Miss Ward will begin by presenting evidence. Margaret placed Tamsin's copybook on the table and opened to the February pages. Lady Tamsin's hand, early in the year. Uneven, but improving. She turned to March. More control, longer phrases, no sign of decline. Then to April. Here the altered phrases begin. Mr. Aveling stepped forward. "I have examined these entries. The child's ordinary hand and the inserted remarks are not the same. The inserted remarks were written later, in a hand attempting childish irregularity." Bracknell gave a dry laugh. Writing masters are paid to make distinctions where common sense sees only schoolroom confusion. Mr. Aveling looked at him over his spectacles. "Common sense rarely leaves different ink on the same page, sir." Lady Ashcombe leaned forward. Margaret lifted the scraped slate, still wrapped at the edges. "This was found after I was dismissed. The sentence had been nearly removed." Reverend Hallow read aloud, his voice troubled. "Aunt Fee said Papa must not see." Venetia's cheeks flushed. "Children invent phrases. They misunderstand." "Then we shall not rely on one phrase," Margaret said. She untied the botanical labels. "Lady Tamsin, you may choose whether to read." Tamsin's eyes flew to her father. Arthur crouched beside her chair. "Only if you wish, my dear." The child reached for the nearest label. Her voice trembled, then steadied. "Primrose, found in the South Garden, April the 9th. A faint breath moved through the room. Margaret handed her another. "Fern, pressed by Ellen because the stem broke." Ellen's eyes shone. Margaret turned to the patronesses. These labels were dated before Mr. Bracknell's memorandum alleged that Lady Tamsin could no longer read correctly under my instruction. The gum and ink were examined. "They are not recent fabrications." Bracknell snapped. "A clever woman can prepare clever tricks." Arthur's gaze hardened. "Mind your words." Margaret lifted the blue card between two sheets of paper. "This was hidden behind the nursery fire screen. Lady Tamsin told us where to find it." Tamsin shrank, but Arthur remained beside her. "You are not in trouble," he said. Margaret read the sentences on the card. "A good child knows less than she thinks. A good child doesn't question those above her. If she reads too proudly, she forgets her place." Mrs. Pell covered her mouth. Reverend Hallow closed his eyes briefly. Margaret turned the card so Mr. Aveling could indicate the lower edge. "The stationer's mark is Bracknell and Low, Chancery Lane." Bracknell's face tightened. My name is not uncommon in trade. Your cousin's name is, Arthur said, and this card matches paper supplied to your chambers last month. Bracknell looked at Venetia. It was a mistake. Everyone saw it. Venetia rose. This is monstrous. A child is frightened, a governess is ambitious, and a grieving father is being led by shame. Arthur, you cannot mean to accept this theatre. Arthur stood. Sit down, Lady Venetia. She did not. You forget yourself. No, I remember myself at last. His voice did not rise, yet it filled the schoolroom. Margaret felt the force of it, then the restraint, because he did not take the evidence from her. He looked to her. Continue, Miss Ward. She opened the hornbook. Its backing had been carefully replaced, but left unsecured for witness. From the dispatch box, Mrs. Vale removed the folded page and handed it to Reverend Hallow, who read the late Duchess's words aloud. The room changed as Eleanor's warning entered it. Lady Tamsin must not be displayed as a drawing-room accomplishment. Miss Margaret Ward must provide a written report before any removal is considered. Lady Venetia Sallow has shown excessive interest in making the child appear deficient. Venetia's fan slipped in her hand. Bracknell's composure broke first. Her late Grace was ill when she wrote many such scraps. Arthur's face went white. You will not use my wife's illness to bury her judgment. Bracknell swallowed. Margaret saw the opening and stepped into it. Who prepared the false memorandum? Bracknell said nothing. Who used the phrase ungovernable dependence before any independent teacher saw Lady Tamsin? Mr. Aveling added, and who wrote the inserted lines in the ledger? The hand bears features similar to the certificate copy submitted through your office. Bracknell looked toward the door, then at Venetia, whose silence abandoned him. I prepared the memorandum, he said hoarsely. At Lady Venetia's request. Only to support a transfer already judged necessary. Necessary to whom? Arthur asked. Bracknell's lips trembled. To those concerned with the child's future establishment. Say it plainly. Lady Venetia wished the child placed at Richmond near Mrs. Sallow's relatives. Funds would follow for education, supervision, and household influence. I was told the arrangement would be advantageous to all concerned. Venetia's voice cut in, coward. Enough, Arthur said. He turned first to the witnesses. Mr. Bracknell is dismissed from all Westmere affairs. His papers will be reviewed by my new solicitor in the presence of Reverend Hallow and Mr. Aveling where appropriate. Lady Venetia Sallow will have no further private access to my daughter, this schoolroom, or any household papers. Her visits to Westmere House end today. Venetia stared as if rank itself had betrayed her. You would cast off family for a governess? No, Arthur said. I cast off deception for my child. He turned to Tamsin and softened before everyone, and for the woman who protected her when I failed to. Then he faced Margaret. The room seemed to recede, leaving only the table, the hornbook, and the sentence that had begun the wound. Miss Ward, I dismissed you before witnesses. I doubted your work before witnesses. I allowed fear and rank to speak where justice should have stood. Therefore, I will not apologize in private. His voice lowered, but every person heard. I said I could hire 50 like you. I was wrong. I could hire 50 governesses, 50 readers, 50 women with capable hands. But I could never hire another Conscience, another Courage, another Margaret Ward. Margaret's throat tightened. She did not lower her eyes. Your Grace. Arthur, he said, not as command, but as offering. If you will allow it. She breathed once. Arthur, his face changed. Not triumph. Wonder. I love you, Margaret. Not because you served my house, but because you taught me how a house becomes worthy of being called home. The words entered the room without shame. Margaret felt every witness, every risk, every hard day behind them. She also felt her own heart, which had not waited politely for safety before beginning to love him. She held out her hand. He did not seize it. He waited until her fingers settled into his. "I love you, Arthur," she said, "but I will only stay where my voice is not purchased, silenced, or replaced." He bowed over her hand, not kissing it, only honoring it. "Then I must make such a place and keep making it." Tamsin slipped from her chair and came to Margaret's side. "Will Miss Ward still hear me read?" Margaret looked at Arthur, then at the child. "Yes, my dear, but not because I was hired back like a missing chair." A small, shaky laugh moved through the room. Margaret bent slightly. "Because truth is easier to keep when people who love it stay near one another." Lady Venetia left without farewell, Bracknell following with the ruin of his folder held against his chest. No applause followed them. The justice was quieter than that and more complete. It remained in the restored copybooks, the witnessed page, the child's straightening shoulders, and Arthur's hand holding Margaret's only because she had freely given it. 6 weeks later, the Westmere house garden held a kind of silence that no one had arranged by fear. It was a mild June afternoon, with sunlight resting on the gravel paths and the schoolroom windows thrown open above the terrace. Rows of chairs had been placed beneath the plane trees, not for patronesses to inspect a child's failure, but for parish girls, daughters of reduced gentlewomen, 2 widowed mothers, Reverend Hallow and his wife, Lady Ashcombe, Mrs. Pell, Mrs. Vale Ellen, and half a dozen household servants who had been invited properly rather than allowed to hover at the edge of importance. On a small table near the garden steps lay a new ledger bound in blue cloth. Across its first page, in Arthur Lydgate's firm hand and Margaret Ward's clearer one, were written the principles of the Westmere schoolroom charter. No child in Westmere House would be shamed into silence. No governess would be dismissed without hearing, wages due, and a written character stating truth rather than convenience. No lesson would be turned into display for adults who preferred applause to understanding. Margaret stood beside that table in a soft grey gown, altered with fresh cuffs and a narrow ribbon at the throat, plain enough to remain herself, and fine enough to show that plainness was no longer being used against her. She was not there as a dismissed governess restored to usefulness. She was there as founder of the new schoolroom practice, honored by the house that had once mistaken her work for replaceable labor. Arthur stood several paces away, giving her the center without pretending indifference from the side. He had learned that space could be a form of respect when it was offered by a man who had once filled every room by habit. Lady Venetia Sallow had not returned to Westmere House. Her name had already begun to travel through London in careful tones, attached to the words unsuitable influence and removed access, which among their set did more lasting work than shouting ever could. Mr. Bracknell's papers had been taken from Westmere Affairs and reviewed by a new solicitor in the presence of Reverend Hallow and Mr. Aveling. Nothing dramatic had occurred in public. No one had been dragged anywhere, yet doors had closed to him with the quiet finality of respectable consequence, and his cousin's stationer mark had become a dangerous thing for men who lived by paper. Margaret did not dwell on either ruin. Justice had been necessary. Revenge would have been another room in which the villains remained too important. What mattered was the child beside her. Lady Tamsin Lydgate wore a white dress with a blue sash, and held one of her own botanical labels between both hands. She had practiced that morning without tears. When Margaret asked whether she wished to read before the garden, Tamsin had looked first to her father, then to Margaret, and then to herself. "I think I do," she had said. Now she stepped onto the low stone step that served as a platform. Ellen stood near enough to be seen. Arthur was near enough to answer if needed. Margaret remained closest, but she did not prompt. Tamsin lifted the label. For one breath, the old fear crossed her face. The garden waited. No one rushed to fill the silence. That was the new lesson. Then Tamsin read, "Rose, opened in the south border after rain." June the 14th. A small murmur of pleasure moved through the listeners, gentle and brief. Tamsin looked surprised that applause did not have to feel like judgment. She read another, "Fern grows best where the light is kind." Margaret's heart tightened. That sentence was not copied from any book. It was Tamsin's own. Reverend Hallow smiled openly. Mrs. Vale touched one gloved finger to the corner of her eye and pretended to adjust her cap. Lady Ashcombe leaned toward Mrs. Pell and whispered, "The child has a very pleasing hand." This time, such a remark did not become a weapon. It became simply praise. When the reading ended, Tamsin came down the step and placed a folded page in Margaret's hand. "I wrote this one alone." Margaret unfolded it. The letters were careful, a little uneven, and wholly Tamsin's. I was believed. For a moment, the garden blurred. Margaret bent so the child could see her face. "Yes, my dear, you were." Tamsin looked toward Arthur. Papa believed too. Arthur came forward then, not with the grand manner of a duke approving a public success, but with the quiet humility of a father who knew belief had come late and must be renewed by conduct. "I did," he said, "and I should have done so sooner." Tamsin accepted this as children accept truth when adults do not decorate it too heavily. She slipped her hand into his. "You do now?" "Yes." He looked at Margaret. "I do now." The garden reading continued into tea. The parish girls were shown the schoolroom materials. The daughters of 2 reduced gentlewomen were invited to attend weekly lessons in reading, accounts, and letter writing, not as charity objects, but as pupils with names written carefully in the new ledger. Margaret signed each name herself. Arthur watched without intruding, though once, when a nervous mother tried to thank him for His Grace's generosity, he corrected her gently. "Miss Ward shaped the charter. I am fortunate to support it." Margaret heard the words from across the table and did not look up at once. When she did, he was watching her, not asking for reward, not asking for softness, simply standing by the truth he had chosen publicly and now kept privately. Late in the afternoon, after the guests had taken their leave and the garden had settled into gold light, Arthur found Margaret near the gate that opened toward the kitchen garden. Tamsin and Mrs. Vale were visible at a proper distance, examining the new ledger with serious importance. Ellen walked the path beyond them with a basket of cups. Propriety stood nearby, but not between them, like an enemy. "Margaret," Arthur said. Her name in his voice still carried the quiet wonder of being permitted. She turned. "Arthur." He did not kneel, not here, not as if turning her into a spectacle after all they had survived. Instead, he took a small velvet case from his coat and held it closed in his palm. "Before I ask anything, I want you to hear what is already settled. Your name is restored. Your written character is complete and yours to keep. The schoolroom charter will stand whether you marry me or refuses me. The funds for the girls' lessons are settled in trust beyond my mood, pride, or future foolishness. You may live as Miss Ward, with honor, under this house's protection. or away from it with my assistance and no claim upon you." Margaret's breath caught, but she did not speak. He had understood the first rule of asking a woman to choose. He had removed the price from the answer. "I love you," he said. "I love your courage, but not only your courage. I love your severity when it protects the weak. I love the way you make truth feel practical, not ornamental. I love that you would rather stand alone than be sheltered dishonestly. And I love you enough to accept that you are free before you are mine, and must remain so after." Margaret looked toward the schoolroom windows above, where once she had left with her keys on the table, and her father's hornbook abandoned behind her. She thought of hunger, accusation, the registry clerk, Tamsin's fear, Arthur's offered arm, his open hand, the kiss that had not promised more than truth could support. She thought of how love, if honest, did not erase the wound. It taught the healed place how to bear sunlight. "Open the case," she said softly. He did. The ring was simple, with a pale sapphire set between two small diamonds, fine enough for his rank, but not ostentatious enough to silence hers. "May I ask?" he said. A smile touched her mouth. "You may. Will you marry me, Margaret Ward?" She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that his hand trembled once, and did not hide it. Then she placed her hand over his. "Yes, because I love you, Arthur. Not because I require rescue. Not because the house has approved me. Not because a child needs me. I choose you." His eyes changed, and for a moment, the powerful Duke of Westmere looked almost young with gratitude. "Then I shall spend my life remembering that choice is not a thing a man receives once and owns forever." "See that you do," he laughed softly, the sound low and unguarded. Then, with Tamsin and Mrs. Vale still at their proper distance, Margaret allowed him to place the ring upon her finger. He lifted her hand, paused for permission with his eyes, and when she inclined her head, pressed a gentle kiss to her gloved knuckles. "I love you," he said again. "I love you too," she answered, and this time the words did not have to fight their way through witnesses, proof, or pain. Tamsin saw the ring and came running only as far as manners allowed before stopping herself with heroic effort. "May I be glad now?" she called. Margaret laughed then, truly laughed. "Yes, my dear, you may be very glad." They walked back toward the house together, Arthur on one side of Tamsin, Margaret on the other, their hands joined behind the child's bright head for one brief, private moment. That evening, when the nursery had grown quiet and the last amber light lay across the schoolroom floor, the worn hornbook rested on the window desk beside Tamsin's page. I was believed. The alphabet beneath its cloudy cover no longer seemed a cage of obedience or a relic of poverty. It was a door. Through it had come a mother's warning, a child's courage, a woman's dignity, and a love that had learned to ask before it held, in the house that had once said it could hire 50 like her. Margaret Ward was no longer being measured by usefulness. She was remembered by truth, chosen in freedom, and loved in the full light of a home that had finally become worthy of the name.